All right, welcome to the Essential Libertarians, giving you the tools for self-governance. Today, I have my favorite pan-anarchist crew, because we like all forms of anarchy. We have Insanity's Free, Jeremiah from Anarch Unity and Agorist Nexus. We have Keith Preston from Attack the System, and one of my favorite people, Noah Starling, who's video game expert and expert on all things liberty and music. I like his shirt.
hmm South of Heaven is better than Rain and Blood, to be honest.
Yeah, Raining Blood, I feel like people look at bands and then they're like, oh, this song's popular, so I like for said song. There's people who hate Nickelback. Yeah, there's people who hate Nickelback, and I feel they hate Nickelback to hate Nickelback. Like, it's cool. And speaking of trends, I also see like the woke trend keeps popping up with the whole like
Grift.
rap song
Just call it a grift.
grift trend. It's to me, it's the same thing. It's like, hey, I want to be cool and edgy.
Nah.
Okay.
Sonic and Shadow are trending right now. They're not a grift.
Imagine calling people soy boys when you watch The Quartering. Like, holy shit.
Mm-hmm. Let me go piss in my basement so that I can get those YouTube views.
Literally, that's the funniest thing is to see like people like I'm anti-woke, I'm against the establishment. It's horrible. It's horrible. Can I get to like the top spot or whatever? And I'm why do you care? Isn't it all bad? Like, well, no, not that. And it seems to me that's kind of the issue in right wing circles now. Like you wanted to talk about like
One of
specific
many.
people. They're going so far to prove something. It's like okay, I get it. I get where your position is, but then they have to go the extra mile. They're kind of acting like Israel is now like, hey, I get it, and they're like, no, you really. They have to go amplified 1,000 times, and then it makes it even worse because now you're just as bad as the people you're opposing because they're going to an extreme, you're going to an extreme. Everybody in the middle is thinking like, what are you doing? What are you trying to prove? There's nothing to prove. You're just being ridiculous. And that's how I feel. That's what I'm seeing now. Maybe you guys are seeing something different or you have different input on it. I don't know who the individual exactly you guys are talking about is. So if you want to um, break that down,
I
that'd
got,
be
I got something funny to share with you guys.
all right.
Any of you heard of the conspiracy theorist Santos Bonacci?
No.
Well, I don't know if I want to talk about how crazy he is by threatening to slit people's throats because they disagree with him.
Yeah, no, I don't like that. Like to me, conspiracy theory is good when you can base it off of something. Like I can say, this doesn't make sense. Look what happened here, and these events don't line up. Or you can say, look, this event happened and nobody did anything to stop it. I think a good conspiracy theory, to be fair, is what happened most recently. All these senators are like, let's get Iran. Like Lindsey Graham says on Fox News, I want to go after Iran. All of a sudden, it's unfortunate, 3 people die, and then every senator and neocon in Washington's like, oh boy, let's get them. Which is funny because Mr. Elon Musk is freedom of speech, but I guess it's okay to ask for World War III if you do it on X. If you're a senator, that seems to be okay. I don't know. I'm that happened more recently. What do you think of that, Keith? Do you think there's some because they wanted war with Iran, and then this is almost like the perfect thing. They're probably like, all right, cool, we have our excuse. Look, it's a tragedy. Everybody gets sad, um, and I feel that would. I don't know if it would help Biden, but I don't know. What's your thoughts on it?
Well, I think that they have been gunning for Iran for a long time. Way back in the 90s, there were plans drawn up to try to topple the governments of about 7 different countries. And while the focus and emphasis of that has shifted over time, it's also true that Iran is the holy grail because they see a range of countries in the Middle East and in Africa that they'd like to get rid of because they won't be incorporated in what's called the Washington Consensus. And in particular, a lot of them are hostile to Israel, and they also there's other geopolitical reasons why they're in conflict with the United States. But the long term plan has always been to do what they've done. They wanted to take down the Ba'athist regime in um, Iraq. They wanted to destroy the Gaddafi government in Libya. Obviously, there was Afghanistan. Syria is another one. Somalia, Sudan, um, and the long term plan has always been to take down Iran because I mean that's the most formidable of any of these countries, and they want to get rid of Iran because Iran refuses to be incorporated into the American dominated international system. They're also the United States is still angry with Iran because of the Iranian Revolution back in 1979. And then, of course, there's the geopolitical rivalry between the U.S. allies in the Gulf and Iran, as well as Israel and Iran. So, yeah, I mean, there are plenty of people in the foreign policy establishment, particularly these neocons like these Lindsey Graham types. So they just can't wait for the opportunity to go to war with Iran. I mean, you see when just recently, in light of some of the recent events, you see that these guys were already licking their chops to go to war with Iran because this is something they've been hoping for a long, long time. This goes back for decades.
You think they'll ever actually achieve it? Because it seems like that's kind of like their big thing. It's like, okay, we're gonna get it. We're gonna get it. It's almost like that, little kid on Halloween, or like, okay, we're about to get it. It's gonna happen. And then eventually everybody's like, no, this is a bad idea. Hopefully, and when we're speaking of conspiracy theories, I don't think that's crazy to say that like these people pop up and anything Iran does, like, oh my God, this woman had a hijab or this woman was wearing this and she got yelled at. We need to do something. We need humanitarian issues. Reminds me of what happened back in 2000, I want to say 2013 and 14 with Assad, and then before that with Libya, and then before that with other people. So that's to me like a good conspiracy theory. I think it helps to especially validate conspiracy theories when you can back them up by evidence and you don't like act super crazy when something gets disproven or something doesn't make sense. And again, that's an issue with the liberty movement as well, is that sometimes like we'll fight over these things. Like there's people who will fight to the death over flat earth. Now, if I accepted flat earth, how would that would stuff in Gaza stop happening? Would stuff in Yemen stop happening? Also, I have my favorite minarchist, but I converted him yesterday. He's an ANCAP now because he's mad at Congress, and I told him there'd be no Congress and a Rothbardian society. So, Night Watchman, welcome. Congratulations on not being a minarchist anymore.
Well, I've always said that minarchy is kind of like the vehicle towards like you hold anarchy as the ideal.
Well,
True.
So here's the deal. Like, in terms of like minarchy versus anarchy, what's interesting to note is that people who don't identify as anarchist always have the kinds of government they don't want to be ruled by, and it's sort of like, you're atheist. No, I'm not. Well, you're atheist to all gods except yours. And it's like, then you realize that maybe there might be something to the argument that they're anarchists to all governments as well, and they just don't like the idea of working with certain other anarchists to all government except theirs. And it's like, you start to realize that there's a lot more common ground. There's a lot more overlap between people who don't want any and people who want it very small. Fucking... like, there's a whole lot more overlap than the state would like us to believe there is. And that overlap is what we should be focused on. It's how we should be moving forward. So if there's somebody who's a minarchist, I think that all you need is that little push to be like, hey, I'm atheist to this government too. I don't want this ruler either. So that's my particular argument there.
I think you could look at it two different ways. I think, yeah, you could do the little push where it's like, hey, come on, get rid of the last bit of the ideological superstructure as the post. Or I was watching, actually, funny enough, one of Keith's videos, and I think there's good reason to work with, like, we're part of a libsoc server on Discord. I have Minarchist friends in Mises Caucus, and I haven't met them, but it would be cool to meet like some David or not David, Henry Thoreau type Enlightenment, forget it, the Transcendentalist type movement, if that is still around, because I guess these things are also maybe people like in the Green Party I could see would be more of like cousin philosophies to an anarchist, where they're like, okay, I kind of want something, but very.
Well, they can be if they're not Malthusian. There's a strong Malthusian bent in green circles that a lot of these circles need to get rid of. Like, there's a strong bent in a lot of these circles, especially the more degrowth-oriented ones, where it's like the world is overpopulated. No, it's actually not. We just need to manage our resources better. Correct. And rule each other less, so that we're destroying things less and using like ownership of certain things or conquest of certain things as a pretext and excuse for that sort of control. You know, like, that's what we need to do. We need to gradually move away from that. And a lot of these degrowth people are saying we start out like overpopulated and overcarboned and over, but they don't tell you exactly what they mean by that. And a lot of the time what they mean by that is, you know, the standard thing that is absolutely true, that is a bumper sticker that everybody should just burn into their brain, is that you are the carbon they want to reduce. Like, sometimes these green motherfuckers are absolutely not anarchist. And, you know, the ones who are, those people are based. The ones who aren't can go fuck themselves.
I agree. Well, okay. To break
and what's
down,
funny about that is that the thing that's always improved things like the environment or like efficiency or lifestyle have always been technology, and yet they'll want more regulation and to slow down innovation and protectionism. So whether it's coming from the left or the right, it's like they're getting in their own way.
I mean, and like, I'm against certain technologies, but at the same time, technology helps in some ways. Like, I'm anti-AI virulently. I oppose AI in all of its forms, like, at least somewhat. But if I were to pick a good use of AI, one of the good use of AIs is to be able to, like, pick out weeds in a agricultural, like, setting and zap those weeds with a laser instead of using pesticides, instead of using herbicides, being like, I'm going to use this AI to see which ones are weeds and zap them before they grow. And that means that you don't need any pesticides or herbicides on crops. That's fucking excellent. It's cheaper. It's better.
Roundup causes healthier too,
but,
which is
glyphosate. Yeah, but like the whole, I still oppose AI. But if I had to choose AI, probably that would be, at least in its current form, reasonably okay. It's just when they start, you know, giving that same AI technology to Lockheed Martin and the lasers are pointed at us and treating us like weeds, you know, because much like the Zionists in Israel, the elites everywhere want to cut the grass. That's the reason that they agree with those motherfuckers, because they think alike, and a lot of these motherfuckers are very Malthusian.
Yes.
Ironically, a lot of that has to do with what they were doing in Congress the other day. They dragged all the tech CEOs down there to whine at them about not doing enough to protect children. And of course, the tech CEOs are all apologizing. And it's kind of like, you have the government being like, why didn't you stop crime? I would have turned around and been like, isn't that your fucking job? Like, isn't that the one thing you're supposed to do? You're like, Facebook made it easier to get access to like certain materials. It's like, remind me which service and which company invented Tor. Oh, right, it was the government. And then you failed to contain the damn thing and let it loose on the world, which is kind of great for decentralization. But, you know, if we're throwing stones here, like glass houses, boys.
Also, like, every libertarian should use Tor. If you don't know how, you're a cuck.
And then And then the next thing too, the other funny thing is that like the tech companies aren't really down there because they're being sheepish and they're afraid of the government. They're down there because they're like, look, if we read people's DMs, people will quit. But if you tell us we have to, then I guess we just have to collect that data.
Yeah, but these
Right?
hearings are for show. That's the issue. Like, I get it, but these Congress people don't know how to use a smartphone. And it's interesting to me you want someone to regulate something who has no. That's why government's inefficient. And that's why I think anarcho pluralism, pan-anarchism, all that stuff is better, because at least people have the knowledge of the society they're living in and maybe the knowledge of the landscape. Like anarcho-primitivists would be very good with nature, and the technical anarchists. And actually, that'd be something I'd be curious to ask Keith, is that let's say you got it down to like 95% where you just had anarchists, but you also had cousin philosophies. What would you think to do? Like, okay, do we keep poking the minarchists and sending them like DMs like, yo, and Catman, or like, all right, he's a minarchist, he's cool, like, let's just go have a beer?
Well, I guess it would depend on what they're actually doing.
Okay.
I suppose that the few remaining non-anarchists left, if they're all conspiring to create a new state, it's more of a problem than if they're saying, okay, you guys just do your anarchy thing and we'll do our minarchy thing. It's
Yeah.
I think this it's probably contextually dependent.
Would you, like, say it's an ANCAP society and you had some minarchists who are like, maybe I want a little bit more. You had some lib socks, or is there still Henry David Thoreau type people walking around? I haven't seen any, but I'd be curious.
What's funny is that this is an argument that I'll use with like some of the online communists that I talk to. Is I'll say they'll argue that their system is more liberty than the anarchy system. I was like, all right, well, think about it this way: if we each got our way, right? Like you'd have your communism, and the people who don't participate in your communism have to be dealt with. But if I get my ultimate anarchy, and you want to make with your friends a little commune like over on the hillside, like that's fine. Just, keep to yourself. So in that case, we both get what we want with my system. Only one of us gets what we want with your system. So which one actually gives freedom?
That's right.
Well, see, it depends, because first off, like there's a huge contention of between people on the libertarian right. And there's a significant segment of these people, and I call them libertarians very loosely because I don't think they are, who say crush the anti-fascist mob. And those people are the same kinds of people that led to, the Justin situation, the guy who recently decapitated his dad because, like, the guy was, fucking a federal agent, but he was like an Army Corps of Engineers guy building like dams and shit. He was not the same kind of oppressive motherfucker as like a cop beating the fuck out of a protester, which, by the way, a lot of fake libertarians are right now very like jacking off on public Twitter timelines about Milei and his crushing of protests. But like, that, or like they're jacking off about razor wire in the water next to Texas and being like, they have the right to self-defense. Fuck you. So like there's a significant amount of people in libertarian circles who will say, I'm libertarian, I don't like government. And then when pushed a little bit, they'll start jacking off about their favorite form of government, especially if it goes against them commies and that leftist and fuck you. Like those people. So if your society somehow became comprised of like the ideologically pure, like philosophically sound, like actually interested in reducing the government rather than universalizing it under the name of like anti-communism or anti-woke or anti-whatever, then maybe. But that's not most libertarians. And the people in the Libertarian Party and people in the extra partisan movement, sort of the outside of the party movement, most of those people are raving shitbags. And that's the reason that they support the people who support the shitbag statist garbage that, like, runs as the primary modes and strains of thought in libertarian circles. So when you end up with these people being in charge, you end up with these people seriously entertaining the concept that the state is acceptable as long as it's like, not lefties, not commies, not wokes, not that sort of thing.
We lost
that-
Night Watchman. Oh.
I don't know, but like that's my point, is that if you have like actual some sort of ideological purity, maybe, but most of them aren't willing to do that. And while being Malthusian is popular with the statists, these people will also agree to a certain extent in population controls and controls of like individuals and their particular groups. So
I think there's a lot of people who, and that's an unfortunate thing. We've talked about that in Mad Liberty as well. I've talked with Mike and my friend Mike and Liz about that. One thing I'm trying to encourage anarchists to do is not like try and grift for the other side. And it happens on the left too. It happens on the right. It happens on the left, where people will say, hey, well, if we just get the Democrat in, well, he's just I'm sure. And that's the interesting thing, that there were people who literally thought, I literally saw people that were saying like, oh, Biden's a Marxist revolutionary. I'm like, for one, Biden doesn't know who Karl Marx is. I don't think he could read Das Kapital or read anything, if being honest. He's not Marx. He's not an ANCOM. He's not even a Marxist. He's not an ANCOM. He's not going to read Bakunin any day soon. Most people don't even. Most people who are pretty, in my opinion, knowledgeable, don't know that there was a good left critique of Marx. So
well, because they're not looking into it, because they lazily just accept what a lot of right-wingers have to say, because they don't they're not reading the Wikipedia entries, they're not listening to the historians. No, they're not. And they're not because they're not, because if they were, they would have already known about this stuff. It's literally available information on the Marx page. You just go to the Marxist Wikipedia page and you find it. So if they're not willing to do enough surface level research to get past the kinds of research that you would need to do, like to pass basic essay writing or basic anything in like high school, much less college, then they're not willing to educate themselves and their opinion can be discarded.
Well, I had the same problem because I fell into that kind of alt-right pipeline. I was going that way with Nick Fuentes and stuff. And then, yes, I found what you were saying. I found what Liz was saying. But there was another guy called Call Me Ezekiel who does very good videos with Anarchy Ball animations. I think he does. Me and Karen Ann Hairloves does. And he explained like very clearly about what happened, the criticisms of Marx and all that type of stuff. But I think what people need to do is realize, A, their statist counterparts serve them in no way. They will never help you. And even ANCAPs who were for Trump, I thought was ironic, because I'm like, Trump increased spending more than anybody else. If your main focus is the economy, well, he's the one who's really printing it up. I think he's printed even more than Biden. I think that's going to be safe to say.
I don't care about that though. Like, I mean, Biden is okay. He is bad, right? Trump sucks. But Biden is like responsible for the Patriot Act. He's responsible for the crime bill. He's responsible for a significant amount of the things that the government does. And so even if he didn't print all that money, which, there was more inflation under Trump, absolutely.
Yeah.
Even if he didn't, he's still continuing Trump's policy.
But that's an ANCAP focus.
Okay.
That's the thing. That's a libertarian. A big libertarian focus is also to look at economics solely and be like, all right, understand this is devastating humanitarian wise, but okay, I want to look at this from an economics perspective. And that's the big thing. If you hang out in ANCAP circles for more than like 3 seconds, it's like, hey, and I even chant "end the Fed" when I'm with my liberty, just in the air. It's kind of like gets contagious. Like, what are you doing today? It's a nice day. Be nicer if we ended the Fed. Yeah. It's like, then you tear your shirt off and you do the gap. But ending the Fed is huge. So Trump weaponizing the Fed is the exact. It's ironic.
Sure. Yeah.
So
sure. I'm just saying, like, it is ironic that libertarians for Trump existed. I'm just saying that I think Biden is just another Trump. So if you're going to compare the two, they're basically the same person, but with different fucking skin. Like, there's a reason Biden hasn't put back Obama's drone reporting mandate, and it's because he likes certain things that Trump did. There's a reason he's still seizing land and building wall. There's a reason that he's, that he's like not prosecuting his son or ending the war on drugs because he's a massively inconsistent shitlip.
Well, I think honestly, these people are all controlled by their donors and corporate interests. Like, I listen to Conor McGregor a lot, and they ask him, "Why are all the you worked in Washington? Why do all these people?" And Keith can elaborate on that. Why do all these people do these things?
Conor McGregor?
Yeah, Conor McGregor. And why are all these people seemingly doing all these things that are like literally genocidal? Like, yeah, let's attack all. And he's saying they're doing it because their donors say, "Hey, we want a war with Iran. We'll give you X amount." Okay, well, I guess they don't say that, but Nikki Haley, same thing. Trump, same thing.
Yeah, Nikki Haley is on the board of directors of Raytheon. I mean, the arms manufacturing company, or she was. I'm not sure if she still is, but I mean, when she's running for office, she knows she's probably not going to be president. What she's running for is board of directors of Raytheon or Boeing or Lockheed Martin. You know, she knows that if she gets a seat on one of those boards, they'll pay her millions of dollars a year for the rest of her life. So, that's why she's such an uber hawk, is because she's being paid by a weapons manufacturer. Joe Biden has received more money from the Israel lobby than any sitting politician in the United States. If you can go to opensecrets.org and see where politicians get their funding from and what kind of interest. And there's this one document that lists which current office holders have received the most money from the Israel lobby, and Joe Biden is number one. Even more so than Ted Cruz and some of the other neoconish Republicans. So yeah, it all comes down to who's bankrolling these people. And the most powerful interests work both ends of the angle. Like, when it comes to the more topical issues, like say abortion or something, one side works the Democrats, but the other one works the Republicans. But the really high level interests work all of it at the same time. Like I know when John McCain and Barack Obama were running against each other, Goldman Sachs was among the top 10 donors for both of them. So whoever wins, Goldman Sachs wins, and that's how the system works generally.
Yeah, I feel it's almost they give you some of these like small, I don't want to call them smaller issues, but they give you some of these wedge issues, as people say, so people can say, "Oh, I'm different." Like, "Oh, I'm not, this ketchup's different because it's a different color, you see." I'm like, "Yeah, but all the ingredients are the same except for one thing." Or like, "Look, this isn't Lay's, it's Great Value. It's different, man. Look, we have different branding." And Jordan Maxwell, who is a good conspiracy theorist, in my opinion, always said, you go to the polls. And why do they call it the polls? Because if a company takes a poll on what they want you to do, or what they want you to look at, they're not a poll they're taking, not so they can change something drastic, but who would you like to represent you while we carry out our agenda? Who would you like to be the face of what the donors and the special interests want? Who would you like?
Well, and it helps them establish a false dichotomy. And that's sort of like the double-edged sword of like, if you don't vote, right, it's kind of like, well, what are you going to do to get my vote? What are you going to do to get me out there to vote? But at the same time, they'll turn around and say like, well, we got 80% of the vote, not 80% of the people voted for us. So 80% of the people that voted for us voted for this. And it's like, well, how many people of the population is that? And you're like, well, like 30%. They won't tell you that part, though.
Yeah, they won't tell you that part. And you know what else they won't tell you is the fact that they already have most, in my opinion, what they want planned. They have all these things planned. They have it ready to go down.
Yeah.
Special interests control this. Special interests, the intelligence agencies, and the bureaucrats have everything ready to go. And they just say, all right, well, my guy's the anti-establishment guy, or my guy's the hope and change guy. And you just put these figureheads and say, look. And then people blame these people at like as if there's something significant. And I'm like, no, there's something behind pulling the chains, and it's not some weird conspiracy.
I think the way to look at it is this: like all of the big policies, like the major economic policies and foreign policy decisions, are made on the basis of the prevailing consensus of the dominant factions of the ruling class at any one point. And then the policies that actually get made are designed in think tanks, places like the Rand Corporation and Brookings Institute and that kind of stuff. And then the politicians are hired by the various interests that are connected to all of these sectors to actually go and implement the policies. But the actual elections are simply public rituals that are intended to convey legitimacy on the state. Just like in the ancient world when they had a ceremony crowning, the emperor because he's descended from the sun god or something. Well, that's kind of what elections are. An analogy I like to use is to pro wrestling. Like in pro wrestling, they will present it as being like this real contest, like a real sport. Even though the players are actually characters, they're actors playing characters. And then the outcome is predetermined by the promoters. And whoever, formally wins the contest, it's all been determined beforehand, and the house always ends up winning. Now that's not. I'm not somebody that thinks all elections are rigged. I mean, I think some of them are. The voters really do, for the most part, get to pick who wins within a very narrow set of parameters because they have all these processes of screening out candidates they really don't want and preventing candidates they don't like from getting on the ballot. But once within the narrow parameters of the actual electoral system, it's not necessarily that every single election is rigged, but it's rigged in the sense that whoever wins the formal contest is going to be somebody who's already been screened for their acceptability to the power elite. And they're going to be someone who carries out policies that have already been predetermined by the power elite, irrespective of who they are. For example, there's a lot more continuity between the policies of different administrations, Democrat and Republican and all of that, than what many people believe. Like Barack Obama largely continued the foreign policy of George W. Bush. Donald Trump was something of a pullback from the Bush-Obama foreign policy, not nearly to the degree his fans think so. And then Biden, to a large degree, has continued much of what Trump put into place, like the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, the trade war with China, some of that kind of stuff. But all of those reflect the dominant, like I said, the dominant consensus of the prevailing factions of the power elite at any one moment. As far as these social questions like abortion and stuff like that, the way that works is that they'll either let the individual states decide, or the federal courts will simply be the arbiters. That the federal courts will be the philosopher kings who decide, what the outcome is going to be. And on all the important issues, the courts pretty much decide with the dominant factions of the power elite as well. Like they may differ in their opinions. Like individual justices or jurists may differ in their opinion on whether the abortion should be a states' rights issue or a federal issue. But they all agree, for example, that corporate personhood law should be upheld. No way in hell is somebody going to be put on the Supreme Court that says, this corporate personhood thing, we should abolish that, or this Federal Reserve thing, we should declare that unconstitutional. That's not going to ever happen.
Man, I hate Raytheon. Shucks, does Raytheon suck? And so does Lockheed Martin, and so does the prison industrial complex, and so does In-Q-Tel. And wait, why is there a red dot on my forehead?
Yeah, well, that's the thing.
Well, I was gonna say, there's 2 points. There's a point I'd like to build on to that, and then I think and something I'd like to raise that's a little bit contrary to what Keith was saying, and that is on one hand, they completely choose for you what your choices are. It's like, do you want broccoli or cauliflower? And it's like, I want steak. Well, that's not on the menu, right? But then what I think we're seeing, though, is I think there was a time when the donors were in charge. But I think at this point what's happened is because they, in the 40s or whatever, gave away all of their power to the bureaucracy, essentially saying we can create, a bureau that acts with the weight of Congress, that Congress could, in theory, at any time step in and intervene. But, and if they don't, it's believed that they act with the authority of Congress. They've given away so much, or delegated out so much regulatory power, that the bureaus themselves can essentially just make anyone who's in office make their life completely hell. They'll find a reason that, show me the man and I'll show you the crime. And I think at this point, we've actually got the tail wagging the dog in that sense, because they're starting to go after donors and things too. You support the wrong candidate, the wrong person, and they're kicking down the door of your corporate offices. And so I think that now what we're seeing is that we're seeing that the call is coming from inside the house, if you know what I mean.
Maybe. Or maybe that's veneer on the surface to make it seem like boycotting some part of the system is going to result in structural power changes, and it's not. It doesn't. That doesn't happen, and it's not even happening now. Like, the structural power is stronger than ever, especially with the rise of AI, especially with the rise of, the mass media circus, especially with the rise of Elon Musk literally copying WeChat, and the WEF and CIA working together to make the two biggest social media platforms in America, basically arms of the intelligence state. Like, the system can make it seem like you're having an impact while it keeps doing what it's always been doing. But I don't think the tail is wagging the dog. Maybe at some point in the future it could, if we started to give them consequences. I would never say what those consequences should be, but we're not giving them consequences right now. Right now, it's a bunch of Republicans complaining about wokeness and saying that boycotting Bud Light is their God-given right. It's dumb. It's not real.
Because I was actually agreeing with what you're saying. I'm saying that, the different bureaus inside the government now have enough power that if a politician steps out of line or a donor steps out of line, the bureaus can make their life miserable. So that's the thing. I'm saying the machine is more powerful than ever before.
Okay.
He was agreeing with you. So.
I thought you were saying that we could use those to wag the dog, because, I mean, if that's the case, I kind of just feel like that's the dog wagging normally. Like, they created bureaus to be unaccountable, and they've been unaccountable, because of the bureaus, because of these third parties that they claim are allegedly private or, somehow separate. So I don't consider that anything but the dog. I don't think that's the tail wagging the dog. I think that would be the common person, doing something about it, the common person getting power. With regard to wagging the dog, I think the dog is operating more dog-like than ever. I think that it's got
I would say in that analogy that the people aren't the tail or the dog. The people are the chew toy at this point.
Okay, but at the same time, the dog's still wagging the way it wants. Just saying.
Well, here's the point I think it comes down to is once people start to get closer and closer to, okay, well, these are just figureheads. My God Emperor and my Hope and Change and all this stuff. This is really just WWE, but it's WWE glorified. And if we can get to that point, I think we can make a fundamental change in how Americans govern. And I also do think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a fan of states, but I do think the lower you get down, okay, well, state has maybe a little bit more, not legitimacy, but it's a little bit less, flash and mirrors. They're still donors. They still spend. They still do crazy things. Even my local government is extremely corrupt. But I think at the local level, you can make, obviously, more of an impact. I do like the saying, all politics is local politics, even in Keith's book. And I would suggest if you're not a hardcore, individualist, or you're reading Tucker, or you're not hardcore like Stirner, I haven't read Stirner, but if you're not that, then generally you'd probably want to get it down to the local level and secede there, not just the individual level. And there is more to do at the local level than just say, hey, but the federal level, yeah, it's all smoke and mirrors, and it might as well be.
But the local level is just the way of keeping the federal level legitimate seeming. Because the local level is the way of making it seem like the common person is consenting. So I don't even like the local level.
Our local level was super corrupt. And I think it might still be there, but the Ingram City Council, for the longest time, their biggest donor was the church across the street, and they made their banner a picture. But this is better. They made their their banner, a picture of the church with a real estate sign in front of it because they were trying to sell this church property, and it was like that for like years.
What? Oh man, I'm gonna die. God.
Yeah,
damn.
I mean, like, here's the thing. Here, I'll go with one.
Jesus needs to come back just so that he can whip those motherfuckers. I'd watch that on paper.
Yeah, and
And the best thing is that they're Democrats too, so it's not a church thing. It's just all money. It's all money.
They're Joel Osteen Christians. But here's the thing I find. I like what Amash said. Someone stood up and said, hey, Justin Amash, my local, this was at a Libertarian Party event, said, Senator Amash, I get what you're saying, local, all that stuff, you're a Libertarian, but my local government's super corrupt. What do you say to that? And he actually had a good response. I didn't like his response on the Constitution, but I liked his local response. And he said, look, decentralization, the myth is that it fixes all problems. It doesn't. Decentralization doesn't fix all problems. Agoristan or ANCAP or ANCOMSTAN is not, or ANPRIMSTAN is not going to be Disneyland. He said what decentralization does is get the problem closer to you, so you're better able to solve it and deal with it.
Maybe.
And he said the best decentralization example is the family, and we all know bad families, but I don't see that we're giving up on families anytime soon. Maybe the global elites are. But I think, hey, if you're going to have, in a world where humans are imperfect, if you're going to have some corruption, and I don't think there would not be corruption in ANCAT or these different anarchist societies, at least can I have it in my backyard?
Yeah, but that's the thing, though. Maybe. Because here's the other problem with decentralization is you get decentralists who are batshit or fucking evil or stupid. Like, for instance, Justin Moan, who was the batshit variety, and he wanted to decentralize because he said that the federal government was unconstitutional and allowing BLM, Antifa, and LGBT to subvert the constitutionality of our republic, and that because of these things, and also the illegal immigration invasion and a bunch of other shit that he was talking about, the federal government should be attacked, and the federal government, not the state government, should be taken down. He's a radical decentralist, but he is a radical decentralist on the side of extreme fascism on a local level.
Yeah, that's not good. See, we're against fascism.
That's the thing, though. Decentralization itself is not a goal. Decentralization itself can be good, but not all decentralization will result in greater levels of liberty, nor will it result in a better culture, because some decentralization is run by absolute evil. And that's like the real shit. The real shit is that our goal needs to be absolute liberty, and that means a decentralization that does not respect absolute liberty. For instance, the secession of Texas from the Union, while it still has its fascist government and wants to put razor wire in the water to push families into, is not a fucking good thing, and it's not 2 thumbs up.
Okay, but listen to my logic. Okay. Evil people always exist. You can make the perfect society based on how everybody. You can get the textbook version of what Konkin or Rothbard or Kropotkin or Bakunin wanted, and you'll still have evil people and bad actors, and that's just built into the three-dimensional experience. Maybe it's to help you learn something through I don't know. I'm not going to get into metaphysics, but what I will say is this: there'll always be bad actors, and to me, I think that, yes, decentralization is not the only thing. You want to teach philosophy. You want to get out there. You want to do direct action. There's other stuff to do, and even use the political system. You can at a local level. I'm not against that. But what I say is we lost Night Watchman and we lost Noah. I don't know. I hope nothing bad happened to Noah. Oh, he said gotta go. Okay. So what I would say is, at the end of the day, decentralization is good with philosophy. That's the best ideal. You will still have bad actors. I would prefer, even though I don't like them, even though I've complained, I prefer crazy Christian Zionists and just saying, fine, They're all in one place. They can't really do much because
They're not all in one place. That's the point.
or they're even in different places, but they're at the local level, and they say, "Let's go, let's advocate for these." They don't really have the ability to do that. You need something like APAC to really get a lot of yes.
You think APAC would stop existing because Texas secedes from the Union?
No, but not just Texas, but
Okay, so how many states would have to secede from the Union before Texas, a state that already has allegiance with Israel as one of its planks, would stop being allied with Israel and supporting them? Because no, you're wrong. They would still support them, and APAC isn't going to dissolve because A does.
It's
No,
part of the federal
it's
government.
a fucking lobbying organization. It's
Yes.
not part of the federal government. It's like,
It works hand in hand with the federal government.
and you think it would stop working with the government of Texas if Texas seceded? No, it wouldn't.
If the states are not okay. If states are not giving the federal government revenue or backing them militarily, that does severely limit. Look, people can like Israel, whatever, but if there's independent nation, if each state is really its own independent nation, not theoretically, and then somebody says, "Oh, let's take revenue from this state and give it to Ukraine or give it to Israel, give it to Taiwan," people would be a lot more hesitant, I think. And let's go to war with. My theory is this: if you told New York by itself, New York's its own country, let's go to war with China, they're like, no. Okay, well, Pennsylvania, you want to do it? No. You all want to buddy up and do it? No. But the federal government just says, "Hey, states, we're all going to war." Oh,
you know who does want to go to war with China? Israel. And you know who does want to go to war with China? Texas. And a lot of these other motherfuckers who have been very specifically anti-China, and Trump uses it as a point of rhetoric, and the right loves to use BRICS as a point of rhetoric, and they have since the Cold War, and it's always going to be a problem even if they secede. It's not changing unless we change the politics. It's wrong.
But yeah, you can change politics. You can do both at the same time. My idea
can't. No.
Yeah, you can do it on. Look, how an entrepreneur builds a business is you have an idea, then you figure out the technical stuff as you go. That's how I built my Fiverr. I didn't know everything I did. I didn't even have a green screen when I started. I started with a crappy. If you saw my first videos, they sucked. I'm saying, not to be Donald Trump, but I like to decentralize first. Figure out the philosophical underpinnings second.
You can't.
You can do that. Somalia did it. Look, Somalia, whether or not you are using anarchy or cryptarchy,
Somalia is persecuted by AFRICOM. The longest running war on terror is happening in Somalia currently. Decentralization before you get rid of the philosophical and political underpinnings that create weakness and statism is going to... Because I'm just describing to you how it's happening in the place that you listed.
But here's the thing. Regardless, I don't know how you're going to do a purity test. Like, hi, knock, knock. Did you read your Rothbard today? No, did you read your...
I didn't say that. What I'm saying is, until we get to a level where people do not want to rule each other, the decentralization will only result in a government that needs to ask less permission to do the same kinds of oppression that it was already doing. That's the government of Texas is fundamentally violating human rights by putting razor wire in the water and pushing families into the razor wire. That's what they're doing, and a whole bunch of states are backing them.
But yes, but two things can be true at one time.
If they're both compatible, they're not.
Look, two things can be true. They can be they're violating the NIP by pushing people into razor wire, and the union is illegally held together because if you really want to go to historical terms, decentralization is better because fundamentally they're not paying criminals in Washington. That's true. They could disband the National Guard. And if you look back to the Civil War, regardless if you agree with slavery or not, Jefferson Davis and Lee had a point in the fact that the southern states voted. They voted. If you're going to consider this a democracy, as everybody says, or a constitutional republic, they voted to leave peacefully. It's not like they say in history books. They didn't just start rioting. They didn't just start burning stuff down. The South voted, and Jefferson Davis is even quoted, "I wanted to be left alone." I'm not saying that's ANCAP stand, but I am saying this. The Union as far as I'm concerned, died at that point, 1861. It was done. The legitimacy, if it ever had it, was gone. There's no legitimacy to holding this union together. It's a bad idea.
So you think
Get rid of that,
the
and
Union
then
had
figure out
legitimacy
what
during
to
the
do.
Whiskey Rebellion? I don't care what's legal. I don't care what the Union wants to be considered legitimate. It's not. That's the problem. The Union was never legitimate. What is legal according to government bastardization of the concept of law is irrelevant. What needs to happen is people need to realize that the government does not give a shit about ethics and that their law is shit. Not that anything is illegal and therefore wrong. It doesn't matter whether or not it's legal. What matters is whether or not it's right. And what's right isn't what's being done by the government of Texas. And by that token, the government of Texas would not be any better if left to its own devices with no external interference. That's garbage. It's not real.
I'm not saying it actually necessarily would be better. I'm saying it would limit federal power because Texas is a huge thing for the economy. And I'm interested in two things. I'm interested in, first and foremost, limiting federal power. That is something that I am interested in from an anti-federalist perspective. Okay? So that's one thing. It's not all like just get to ANCAP, because I understand you're not going to get the ANCAP stand from what we have from, extreme neoliberalism, which is what we have now. So I am interested in limiting federal power. I think that's something we need to do. Not only do we need to do it, I think that's something that is a good goal. And then as you limit federal power, as you get closer to the source, which is the individual or the local community, however you want to see it based on your perspective, then you can start to come up with ideas and decentralize. But it's kind of pointless to do that. I'm looking at this from an entrepreneurial perspective of, I have an idea, I want to start building it. And you're like, well, you don't have all the funds. You don't have the perfect idea. You don't have all the employees. You don't have everything in place. Don't build a business.
No, I'm not. I'm saying your business is being built on the footprint of somebody else's, and they're not going to fucking let you.
Okay, I don't know. Even though, but I wasn't actually planning to have a debate. Keith, what do you think? Do you decentralize first, or do you throw philosophy down first? And then how do you know it's a good time to pull the plug on federal power? I don't know.
Well, you can approach that from a lot of different angles. I tend to favor what I would call a multi-dimensional or multi-layered approach that's oriented towards fighting on all fronts, meaning that I would agree with Jeremiah that the idea of decentralizing just for the sake of decentralizing is not necessarily an end game unto itself, because as he was saying, theoretically you could have a whole lot of micro states that practice slavery. A good example would be, on one hand, I think ancient Greece, which had like it was a collection of a few thousand cities with no overarching central government. In some ways, that's a prototype for a quasi-anarchistic system. But then if you look at some of the internal features it had, they practiced slavery. They had a very rigid, stratified social system. Women had about as many rights as they do under the Taliban. And those are just a few examples. So it's not that decentralization is an end unto itself. It's only a means to an end. So there's different types of activism. Like you can do ideological activism, and that's I'm hesitant to call it missionary work, because we don't really want to have an anarchist Jehovah's Witnesses or something. But we can go knock on doors on Sunday afternoon. Do you know Bakunin, brother? Well, I've met anarchists about like that. So
Bakunin.
Do you have a moment to talk about our Lord and Savior Sonic the Hedgehog?
Yeah, I can see Jeremiah legitimately doing that and then doing the whole thing.
Well, I mean, just as an aside, I was at an anarchist conference in Chicago probably about probably about 35 years ago. And there was this one highly sectarian group involved in that. And there was this other group that was making fun of them. They were going around passing out these pamphlets that, designed to look like religious tracts, only they're about anarchy. and they would go up to you and say, "Excuse me, brother, but do you know Bakunin is your Lord and Savior?" And, and
That's
but
kind of
not,
creepy.
but so well, it was just intended as a joke. They were just
Oh, okay.
they
I
were,
wasn't
they were
sure.
just making fun
Vermin
of-
Supreme level shit.
yeah. But they but now you have ideological activism, and that's about you try to persuade people of the validity of your point of view, and you can do that, in a number of ways. Seminars, workshops, writing articles, YouTube channels, whatever. So there's the idea of you convert other people to your point of view, but then there's institutional activism, and that's more like what you're talking about as far as decentralization. You work towards spreading, or not just decentralization, but just changing institutional structures in a more anarchistic direction or whatever.
Yes, yeah. So
And then there's also topical, activism. There are things like legalizing marijuana, or defending the right to bear arms, or resisting the draft, or whatever the issues are in any one society at any one time. But all of these things are not mutually exclusive. There's there's this concept I've talked about. If you've read some of my stuff, I've talked about this concept of pan-secessionism. A lot of times that idea is misunderstood because they think, well, it's just about reviving the Confederacy or something. But no. Territorial independence can be an element of pan-secessionism, but then so can general strikes, so can counter economics, so can dual power, alternative infrastructure, intentional communities, mass civil disobedience. All of these kinds of things fall under the banner of pan-secessionism because they're all about withdrawal from an existing system, or creating parallel systems, or pulling the rug out from underneath a particular system. So I tend to think it's not necessarily important. It's not necessary to pick one model of activism over others. Even when it comes to things like reformism, I would not condemn out of hand somebody who votes for the Libertarians, or the Pirate Party, or whatever kind of party like that they're interested in. But I would say if you limit it to that, it's going to be very self-limiting. For instance, if you are voting for some kind of reformist party, you also want to have an on-the-ground movement that is capable of leaning on politicians or government or elected officials or whatever to keep them in line. All governments have to make certain popular concessions. There's certain lines a government cannot cross without losing legitimacy. And that can vary according to the culture. But let's say in a society where Islam is the prevailing religion, and 85% of the people there are of the Islamic faith, like say Indonesia. Well, the president of Indonesia couldn't come out and say, "Yeah, this Islam thing really sucks." That guy's going to lose his legitimacy overnight. He may get toppled. At bare minimum, he's going to get voted out of office. And
Gamal Ataturk did that in Turkey. So I guess I'd break it down like this. I'd be interested. Okay, I'll throw a hypothetical. Let's say you can push the button theoretically. And what I mean by push the button here is just separate the states, which people are actually talking about now. Like maybe it's just me, but a lot of people are like, wait, the federal government's not doing what they're supposed to do, which is interstate commerce, and they're not doing good with defense. And I think we'd agree with that as anarchists, or even minarchists or classical liberals. And I know for a fact if I open up a lot of people's X's or Twitter or whatever it's called, there'll be atrocities in Gaza. And I don't want to see that. I don't think anybody wants to. Most reasonable people want to open up their phone and see that, oh, wow, 10 more kids were killed and stuff. In my opinion, if the United States could not help Israel, and we all three agree with that, a lot of this would stop or be significantly limited. But yes, I could see a lot of crazy religious groups happening in decentralization. So since life is about managing cost and effect, and there's no perfect scenario, if someone said you hit this button, the atrocities overseas stop, but you might have some radical skinheads in your neighborhood who you might have to deal with later, what would you do? And I'd probably be like, fine, let's let the anarcho-fascists have their own community. as long as we can stop seeing the atrocities stop, as long as the inflation stops, and as long as I stop getting taxed by the federal
Okay,
government.
but here's the thing. That's not foundational. Okay? Yo, like, this shit didn't start out this way. The U.S. hasn't been supporting Israel for over half of its existence. Still, the U.S. is now supporting Israel for nearly half of its existence. And it happened that way because the U.S. didn't give a fucking shit about genocide. It doesn't give a fucking shit about, like, damaging people. It doesn't care. And that means that if you have these skinheads in your neighborhood and they are getting power unabated because they are no longer constrained by the federal limits on civil rights violations, then yeah, they're going to find another place to genocide because that's what they want to do, and because they think they're ethically just in doing so. And if you don't get them on the philosophical page first, if we don't get people on the philosophical page first, then pushing that
But not
button,
everybody's going to do
just
that.
put it, then pushing, then it doesn't matter.
Let me ask you this.
They're still going to lose. There's still going to be genocides. There's still going to be things happening overseas. Nothing changes.
So one day I asked my trans friend Mike. She said, or they said there was a lot of issues with people who antagonize them, which I believe that. A lot of people antagonize trans people for no good reason other than to do that. And Mike said, I wish they were all gone. I said, Mike, look, you're probably not going to have a perfect world where everybody accepts people, maybe who are trans, or maybe you're this, or maybe you're gay, or this, or Muslim, or whatever it is. I guess my question to you guys is, this is a really hard, I guess maybe it's in defense of anarcho. If we have people with really, really bad ideas, which will always exist, irrespective of the climate and irrespective of the lack of centralization, isn't decentralization better to have people with bad ideas all in one neighborhood? Look, that's the
not all in one neighborhood.
But they would
the Azov movement.
Yeah,
they're in Europe, AFD. They're in fucking, like, they're everywhere.
Yes, but that's a state. Ukraine is a state. What I'm saying is decentralization would be better, because I say, look, you all hate Muslims, right? You all look.
Decentralization of states is still states.
Yeah, but I'd be fine. I would be cool. Look, I'd be cool. 2 towns down from me. Have your Christian Zionist movement. Talk about the world ending. Talk about, having everybody in the Middle East duke it out. Just stay in your corner. Stay in your corner. Don't ever.
That isn't going to happen.
It will in decentralization, because people
will
say, oh, this
won't.
Is my people, this is my people, this is my. I would hang out. Yeah, but it does, because here's the thing.
It doesn't.
But I hang out in EXE. I hang out Mad Liberty. I hang out with Mises Caucus. I hang out in mostly libertarian circles, because I believe in decentralization. The more people see that, the more decentralization happens.
The U.S. government started out decentralized. The U.S. government started out as a splinter.
No, as a minarchy. A minarchy is not.
No. Minarchy is decentralized. If it's
still a centralized state.
If it's breaking off from centralization in the European countries from which it came.
But it started with a federal government. If it started out as local,
it didn't start out with a federal government. It started out as colonies.
But then they decided, after the Articles of Confederation, that they needed a federal government. So, okay, fine, yes. Technically, it started out as colonies. Then we have Articles of Confederation.
After they split up, after they decentralized from Britain.
I don't know.
So because they decentralized from Britain, they got their way. Look, and as a result, they slaughtered the natives. They enslaved black people, Irish people, Chinamen, all these things. They got what they wanted because they decentralized, and because they were no longer beholden to anyone but the French, of course. And that's why the Whiskey Rebellion was crushed.
Look, here's the thing. I'm against racism. I'm against people, the woke grift or trend or whatever you want to call it. I'm really tired of Tom McDonald just writing the same song over and over, saying the same thing. Vary up your message at least, damn it. And, oh man, woke is bad. I don't care. Have 50 pronouns. Here's the thing. Just be against genociding people, inflation. But at the end of the day, you're a fan of, you said Konkin was right over Rothbard. And I used to say, oh, the only difference between agorists and ANCAPs is they vote. And then someone who's an agorist stopped me and said, no, Kareem, here's how it would work. And they read Konkin, and they told me, based on, and Keith knows Konkin, so you can confirm this if I'm right. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. An agorist would say, you have your garden, you do your thing, you keep it local, you don't get multinational. It wouldn't be called corporations in ANCAP, Stan, but you don't have multinational entities doing stuff. An ANCAP would say, no, I want to scale my business to China, Korea, America, Europe, blah, 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 blah. But if you really are a student of Konkin, in my opinion, then you keep it local. I mean, that I'm not a genius on Konkin. I actually am not great with any of the schools, but I know about all the schools. You guys can tell me, am I completely wrong? Konkin would say keep it local. He would. I believe if Konkin was here, if he did a seance and pulled him out of the earth and he's like, bruh, how far do we scale this? He's like, homie, keep it local. I'd be like, right on. We'll get
Well, from what I recall of Sam's views, he his main thing was, as we know, counter economics or agorism. And so his main emphasis was on voluntarism rather than on scale per se. Like Sam, I think probably would have made the argument that if you keep it voluntary, if you use counter economics or agorism as your model, and then you keep it voluntary, then by extension, it's going to be very hard for corporations, say, to scale to a certain level. So you get this kind of economic decentralization by default. Although from what I recall, Sam wasn't really more about decentralization as much as voluntarism.
Okay.
Someone like Kirk Sale was really big on decentralization. He's also very anti-tech. But my take on all of these things is that it tends to be contextual and it's a matter of trade-offs. Like, for example, your question you raised earlier about, well, should we push the button and make the United States go away or make every state an independent country or something like that? Given the option, I would personally push the button. Now, I wouldn't condemn somebody who said no, they wouldn't for some other reason. They may have a good reason for feeling that way. But I would push the button. And the reason why is because in the United States, if we look at the history of the last 75 years, the United States has probably generated a body count internationally higher than most other countries combined in terms of just sheer casualties. So the United States has been probably the most murderous regime since the mid 20th century onward. And not because Americans are uniquely evil people, but simply because the American government has been the most powerful state during that time. And by extension, it's had the most opportunity for expansionism and the things that go along with that, which is mass killing. As you mentioned, right now, if we look at countries around the world that have some of the very worst records in terms of death and destruction, substantial numbers of them are funded and armed directly by the United States. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, on down the line. If it's a crummy regime, chances are it's probably funded by the United States.
And the opposition to those, like for instance, Biden unfreezing $6 billion, and then suddenly Hamas has money.
Well, that's one thing to consider. Is that the one thing that I'm interested in is the way in which transnational elites coordinate activities in ways that cut across boundaries of formal enemies. Like we've talked about Anthony Sutton on some of the previous programs, and Sutton was good at examining that, talking about how you had American Wall Street investors, in trading with Nazi Germany in the middle of World War II.
Yeah, I cited him in my anti-Nazi article you cross-posted.
George Bush Sr., his father, Prescott Bush, he was actually using slave labor in Auschwitz during World War II. And he didn't stop until it was found, it was publicly exposed. Then he started trying to roll it back. Mm-hmm. But in the case of the United States today, I would push the button and we would have 50 independent states. Now that doesn't mean that utopia would come out of that.
No,
it is true that some smaller states may intensify the level of oppression that they inflict on localities. Although I would say that a localized system of oppression is typically easier to evade than a mass system, depending on the context again. Also, if the United States fragmented into multiple countries, that might strengthen other states that have pretty awful records as well, like Russia and China. So none of these things are panacea. It's no system is perfect. It's just like all the different hyphenated forms of anarchism. Like the big question with anarcho-capitalism is how do you prevent that from evolving into or devolving into an oligarchy,
State capitalism.
yeah, or anarcho-communism. How do you prevent that from becoming an actual capital C communism? Or anarcho-syndicalism. How do you prevent that from becoming a mass bureaucracy? Or Georgio-anarchism or Georgist anarchism? How do you prevent that from becoming just another tax farming system? And
That's a good question about.
You could go down the line of every belief system there is.
But that's the thing. That's the reason that like if you want to talk about Konkin, which was the original question, like Konkin would say, "You're already decentralized, motherfucker. Act like it." Konkin would say, "You've already got the ability to act in a freer manner, and you should just do it instead of waiting for permission, instead of waiting for somebody to push the button. Push your own fucking button." That's Konkin's stat, and he's right. We should do that, and we should get people on board with that. And the reason we should get people on board with that is because if we don't have like the actual decentralization in our minds, on our foundations. And if we don't, then the states, like it's sort of like how Biden was in Congress saying that if we didn't have an Israel, I would create one. It's the same shit. And he got thunderous applause there with all these motherfuckers. If you just somehow magic disconnected them, you're not magically disconnecting the parts of their minds that want to control people. What you are doing is you're saying that these people are acting with freer reign. What that would mean is all the states that wanted to do what they wanted to do would reconnect with the other states of a similar mind. They are not going to remain a non-powerful bloc and stop their power isolation. Rhode Island is tiny. There is no way that they would not federate with other states. New York is tiny. There is no way that they would not federate with other states.
I'm not saying states wouldn't federate.
So there would be new unions. There would not be a scattershot, decentralized world. It wouldn't happen even if you push the button.
It happens over
the consequences of pushing that button without the philosophy at the root and at the foundation would be that people would not be agorists. They would be anti-agorists. They would form these coalitions between states for the states and their statist purposes. And that's what would really happen. And so if we don't start from that philosophical foundation, we lose by default and we lose in the long run. And that's why I wouldn't push the button, because the button doesn't teach people to be better. And until people learn to be better, the button doesn't fucking matter. And it will only make us more vulnerable to either people on a bad actor level, on a more local level, or to foreign states that already fucking hate us and
people aren't going to get better. Some people aren't going to get better. I don't think. Okay, here I'll give you an example. Like I was telling my friend, they're like, I don't like Gavin Newsom. I'm like, honestly, well, here's my opinion, and this is a radical position, and this is a radical position in Chicago. Some people just won't get better. If you can go up to gang members and be like, here's Anatomy of the State, they're like, thanks, Green. That's a nice book. If they don't shoot you first. So you're not going to convince some people who are inherently in the effect of a coercive mindset to be better. Some people are just got Genghis Khan on the brain in a very small level. I guess I'm saying in a very, very crazy way, it would be better to get rid of Gavin Newsom because you can fight off the Bloods and the Crips and maybe survive than fight off the police.
You're not getting rid of Gavin Newsom by giving him his own government. That's what decentralization of the states
no. What I'm saying is
country would do. That's what pushing the button would do under your framework.
In my framework, I don't have a framework.
You just listed a framework.
I have ideas that can be used to create a framework. Also, I have a question, Keith. For lack of a better understanding, syndicalists, ANCAPs, and everybody else like to dog on the primitivists. Is there any, like you say, ANCAP stand can be state capitalism, ANCOM stand could be state common. Is there any actually risk with the primitivists where people say like, oh my God, they're going to unplug grandma, and they're not going to let me have my Netflix and chill or what. They're not very coherent arguments, but do they even have any significant power with the lack of technology to do that? Is that even a legitimate concern in any way?
There is. I once wrote a review of Ted Kaczynski's book. I forget what it was called.
Industrial Society and Its Future.
No, that's the original manifesto that was published in the Washington Post like 30 years ago. But he actually wrote a book in prison, and I wrote a book review of it. And I can't remember what it was called. Why Anti-Tech Revolution or something like that. But in that particular book, in that particular review, one of the things that I did was I critiqued some of Kaczynski's plans, saying that this could eventually become a Pol Pot type of situation.
Mhm.
Because he's basically about achieving anarcho-primitivism through what amounts to Stalinist methods, and that's not too far off from what Pol Pot was trying to do. I think that particular philosophy has its dangers as well. This is it. Ted's publisher told me that Ted had read my review and wanted to write a response to it, but as far as I know, he never did, and he's since passed on. But primitivism could be twisted in some kind of direction like that. So could the opposite end, transhumanism.
Yeah.
Yeah, transhumanism could evolve into something like the old eugenics movement or something like that. So you have these dangers in any direction you want to go in. It's not like any one system is foolproof. Even things like anarcho-pacifism, like some people say, well, what could possibly be dangerous about pacifism? But George Orwell talked about that. He said that a problem with a lot of pacifists is that they also tend to be hyper moralists. And in a world where they were dominant, there might theoretically be less violence, but it might come at the cost of a very hyper conformist, society that stifles the individual. And we see prototypes for that today. Like one good example is the Amish. The Amish are pacifists. They refuse to serve in the military and stuff like that. And they're generally a pretty good group of people, all things considered. But it's also true that internally they have a culture that's very antithetical to individualism. It's a very conformist, collectivist culture. And maybe that's okay. Maybe as long as nobody has to join them, that's compatible with anarchism or whatever, libertarianism, voluntarism. But imagine an entire civilization like that. It's that's another issue. And we could go on down the line. Like
We could.
One issue is, what about anarcho-feminism? One issue that anarcho-feminists bring to the table, and I think they're right, is that I've heard some of them argue that it's possible there could be a society without a state, but where patriarchal values are so deeply ingrained that women are still, a subordinate class of people, even if it's not done with a formal state setting. In Saudi Arabia, for example, today, I think even if the state went away, the House of Saud said, we're done with this. We resign. Do your own thing. And the Wahhabi clerics said, whatever. We're not going to bother with this anymore. I do think that the culture would be such that you'd have a whole lot of people that would still want to maintain the kind of patriarchal institutional infrastructure that they have that's reinforced by cultural norms or social norms. And you can find parallels to that in a lot of things. For instance, let's say at the end of the U.S. Civil War, we know from experience that after the U.S. Civil War, technically slavery was abolished. It was even outlawed by the Constitution, the 13th Amendment. But did that keep people from holding what were de facto slaves? No. Slavery was still illegal by that point, but the sharecropping system that existed in the post antebellum South was basically just slavery under another name. It was slavery. They just didn't call it that anymore. So any kind of system can theoretically be abused or restructured in a way that creates some kind of authoritarian paradigm.
Okay. Interestingly enough, I've talked to free staters in the New Hampshire movement, and I've heard one of them say, like, oh, I said, like, this is pretty, do you see this as a successful anarchist movement? They say we're getting there, but they've actually told me, like, Kareem, actually the most successful anarchist movements in Pennsylvania. I'm like, where do you see that? We don't have any. I don't know of any. We have you mean the Libertarian Party? And they said, no. They said, Kareem, the Quakers and the Amish. Mm-hmm. I said, I don't know if I would, and after you told me Twin Oaks, so maybe the Amish, funny enough, out of everything, I support creating of new communes. I support Jeremiah's Anarchy House, but we're going to talk about on a mass scale, a small mass scale. I think it could be considered the Amish, the Quakers, and Twin Oaks, which I haven't researched, in the United States are the most successful anarchist movements. That being said, they're I guess they'd technically be on the left, like Amish being some form of green anarchism and some form of, even though they don't call themselves that, ANCOMs. And then I would think, if it's not wrong to dissociate the Twin Oaks as an actual ANCOM society, even though they don't call themselves that. But I think those are close, and then there. So,
but here's the deal, like, so those people did not result from breakaway states. Those people did not result from Rhode Island suddenly being its own government. Those people made their own freedom and then told everybody else to deal with it and defended that. That is the path to anarchy. It gets closer than this button pushing. That is the path that we could follow right now. We don't need this magic button. We have the button. It's here already. And that button would result in untold evil. That button would result in mass catastrophe. That button would result in a huge amount more governments in the world who would all want to compete with each other to become the biggest governments, and with no unity and allegiance to one another, because no United States existed and they had no obligations. They had no way that they were trying to like maintain funding or commerce or trade or whatever. If they had none of that, then they would have no more incentive to remain peaceful with each other. Then they would have no more incentive to remain peaceful with each other than they did when the Civil War happened. But this already was tried. See, you don't let me finish. Like, why do I even fucking come on these programs if you're going to interrupt me, man? So, like, this was already tried. If we want this to work, it has to start from an anarchist level philosophically. If it doesn't, the states already don't like each other. The states already fought each other. The states already proved that they cannot exist separately in harmony with one another, especially since a lot of these states were upset about slavery being threatened and never got over it. And ultimately, let's be real here, those people are not going to be good for international liberty any more than they would be for domestic liberty, and they would block up just like any other group of people would block up with other people in the groups that they are feeling most compatriot with. And that is the people who are most okay with slavery or most okay with their particular forms of genocide in the form of the natives or the Palestinians or them brown Muslims or any of these other sorts of things that they already support destroying. And those people, if they didn't, would already be protesting en masse the war machine, and they would have been doing it for decades. But most of these people don't. Most of these people who want secession also want the war machine, and currently their governments are lobbying the most effectively for it. So when you tell me that you think that pushing that button and making all these states their own self-contained governments, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about when you say that that would be better, because these states are still statist. And that is the problem. The problem isn't that there's a federal government. The problem is their mentality. And that's the reason Justin Moan is a great example of these motherfuckers, because he said, yes, the federal government is the bad guy. The federal government is the problem. The federal government is the root of all of our concerns. And then he cut off his dad's head because he was a Fed, declared himself president because he said that he was like the leader of this global militia. And then he said that my idea of decentralization needs to take hold. And if it doesn't, I'm putting millions of dollars down to bounty other people's heads. If you think that like there aren't people involved in decentralist movements who are authentically damaging to liberty, and if you think that these people wouldn't jump on the opportunity to get exactly what they wanted if they had their way, if they no longer were beholden to the federal government, if there was no longer a central entity to stop them from being the kinds of pieces of shit that they wanted to and getting all the control they wanted, I advise you to reconsider why the fucking Texan government is claiming the right to self-defense and saying that if we can't put razor wire in the water and are being blocked from that by Biden, we're going to secede. Because these people have fundamentally unethical reasons for wanting their governments to operate the way they do, and that's not going to change. The funding to Israel, in fact, would probably get worse because they wouldn't have people like the blue state fucking coastal leftist blah, blah, to say that, no, in fact, we'll at least make lip service to anti-war causes. We'll at least make lip service to saying don't be colonist and imperialist. We'll at least say don't, even though we'll vote alongside the military and intelligence industrial complex anyway. They won't have that. They'll be unabashed Zionists. They'll be unabashed genocide apologists. They'll get away with it easier. These people will get funding more. In fact, better funding because it won't be beholden to the central fiat currency. So, like, no, it's not just going to go away because you push a button. And in fact, the button might make things worse because there are so many thousands, millions possibly, of Justin Moans out there who are insane, unhinged, delusional, violent, abusive whack jobs who would get their way immediately if you gave them that.
Who is this Justin Moan person?
He beheaded his federal employee dad and then held the head up on a YouTube video twice because he said that this guy was a federal employee for 20 years and you're going to start having to kill your family members in order to get like freedom. He also believes he's the Messiah.
Well, this sounds like somebody that's got schizophrenic.
Yep.
Yeah, he's got some problems.
And we need to get those sorts of people disempowered. Right. Not help them get more of it by saying, yeah, you know what? Any sort of decentralization, that's good. Because it's not. Some decentralization is not good because some decentralists are evil.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. This is a debate that's gone around in anarchist circles for years, particularly the more lefty anarchist circles.
Yep.
Years ago, Noam Chomsky caused a stir because he was saying that even though he's an anarchist, he said he's more concerned about private power than state power. And by private power, he means mass corporations and that kind of stuff. And he was saying that he would prefer, in the context we're in now, well, I mean, he was talking probably, 30 years or so ago, but close enough to be relevant to now. He was saying that he would prefer the federal government's power to be increased in order to rein in the power of corporations. Now, I do see the argument that says, well, decentralism outside of context could produce all kinds of things. Like, for example, the Startup Societies Foundation, that's one thing they're big on. They're big on new country projects and secessionism and micronations and all that. But then they also have a statement that says, well, that doesn't mean we endorse anything that this could produce, like a death cult like Jonestown or something, or ISIS or whatever. But so I guess that's the downside of decentralism. But what would you say to somebody like Noam Chomsky? Would you say that private power is worse than public power? Would you say that in a system like ours, more government to restrain corporations is better, because that seems like taking the anti-decentralist argument to the other extreme. But I do come across people like that in some more of the socialist and com leaning type of anarchists.
The real truth is that there's no separation. Private and public power have been merged for a long time. So I would say to Noam Chomsky that the reason private power exists is because of public power, and it's not a question of which is worse. It's a question of smash it all.
Yeah, well, my critique of how modern state systems work is that the analogy I like to use is one that gets around this whole public versus private, socialism versus capitalism thing, because I like to use an analogy to the Middle Ages, where if you look at the structure of medieval societies, okay, you had the monarchies, the hereditary royal dynasties, the kings and his ministers, the king's knights. You also had the aristocracy, and then the aristocracy was layered. You had the barons and lords and manorial systems and all that. And then you had the Catholic Church, with its own, vast wealth and that kind of stuff. But all of that, all that collectively was the ruling class, though. I mean, any serious historian that examined the Middle Ages and their institutional structures would say the king, the aristocracy, the knights, the church, they were all part of the ruling class. And a lot of our political discourse today is kind of like, is comparable to, let's say you had peasants in the Middle Ages saying, well, I'd really like to give more power to the king. And others are saying, no, let's give it to the church. And others are saying, no, let's give it to the feudal lords. Let's give it to the aristocracy. And that's what a lot of the debate in mainstream culture seems to be about. And even in anarchist and libertarian circles, you see that, like this whole, what sector of the ruling class do we hate most? It's like, I've seen, I mean, there are some anarchists from the left who fall into the vote blue no matter who, because Trump is back,
because they're cucks.
Yeah. So because at least Biden won't genocide people of color, even though he does, and you see that, obviously we've seen that you guys seem to be more experienced with the libertarian sector. But the libertarians, I see the same thing there. I see a lot of libertarians that become Republicans as soon as some mainstream issue comes into play. Like one of you mentioned libertarians for Trump. I was like, I mean, I don't, like I said, I don't begrudge anyone for voting or whatever. Do what you want to do. But the thing is, actually going out and saying you're promoting Trumpism. As like I know Walter Block was doing that, and Stefan Molyneux was doing that. They were out there calling themselves libertarians for Trump.
And so is Liberty Hangout.
Yeah, and what is Walter Block doing now? Now he's for Zionist genocide. So it seems
and so
like
is Trump. He supports Israel. Hey, and so do these people support Milei, who supports Israel. And hey, it's almost like this is a recurring theme, and statists are a problem in the libertarian movement.
Yeah, and then Robert F. Kennedy as well. I've even heard him floated as a potential LP candidate, and he's as Zionist as they come. I mean, he's got that freak, that Rabbi Shmuley guy as his advisor, on Middle East policy.
And he's also an anti-trans whack job and an anti-woke fucking grifter. So I mean, you get it all in the same package.
You do.
So.
All right. Well, I guess I'd throw one maybe objection. Sorry for interrupting. Sometimes I get heated myself.
I never get heated, so I can't.
No, that never happens. You're a nice. I would like to see. How about one show where like Calm Jeremiah, like, hey guys, how you doing? I think we'll defeat the globalists, and I'm doing fine.
Yeah, but you believe in shapeshifters, so you would just assume that.
Yeah, probably.
My skin got stolen by some weak ass little cunt.
All right. So here's my cryptarchy, or what I would call, I don't know if Konkin ever used the term, but red market equilibrium, which I think is a thing that exists. I think it's fair to say that my studying of 1990, because what was the big thing during the George Bush era? If you don't like it, move to Somalia. And then through Leeson, which maybe I have him on. He's one of the best economists of our time, in my opinion. Jeremiah disagrees. That's fine. But what he showed is after 1991, after they overthrew Muhammad Said Barre, the United States tried to get involved. They failed. Ethiopia tried to get involved. They failed. And then it was bad for a few years. But then warlords checked each other's power. Now, warlords are not good people. They have not read Philosophical Anarchy. I'm sure of it. I'm sure none of them is like, man, you know what I need to do? Bro, give me Conquest for Bread. Give me Future Primitive. I got to sit down and read that. Oh, is Anatomy of the State in the library? I need to check that out. These people are predicated on violence. But if we're going to argue for decentralization, even in a hostile environment, they checked each other's power, and the homicide rate based on their tribal custom standards went from what it was to about maybe the rate in Mexico. That's not it's not good, but we're getting somewhere better. So I'd argue that maybe in the face of even hostile conditions, that cryptarchy, if that is a word, or what I would call red market equilibrium, which I think is just a fancy term I made for like Al Capone sitting down with the Irish and the Jewish mafia and saying, man, we all want to run alcohol. Let's not kill each other. Okay, Mr. Capone, we won't kill each other. Is that a perfect world? No, they're gangsters. Is that a perfect world? No, they're warlords. But through power checking, you actually get a better system through people who might be inherently violent because they check each other's power. Is that anarchy? No. Is that a little bit closer to decentralization? Yes. Is Somalia the ideal?
Sometimes.
Somalia proved to me that relative decentralization can be good even in extremely violent circumstances. I don't know, Keith and Sandy, you could disagree or agree with me, but what I saw is a huge standard. Like, I don't like these international corporations either, but Coca-Cola, Nestle, all these things wanted to invest in Somalia. They were able to have flights. They even interviewed a guy, and he said, corruption is not a problem. Corruption is not a problem because there's no government, yeah? And he said, we don't have a central government. We maintain the airports. We do the things. Is there corruption? Yes. Was there theft? Yes. But Leeson makes the argument a warlord saying, pay me dues is not the same thing as a state because they can't take it from you. Like if
He's
Joe
wrong.
Biden, but his reasoning is good because here's what I'd say in the finish is that he says it's not a state. He says like a mugger says, give me your money. You're like, you don't really have the power to coercively tax me. If you can't beat me physically, then you can't win. And he said that's the same way. He's like, is it theft? Yes. Is it state-like? Yes. But it's the same way a mugger acts in a state. I don't think we want to call a mugger a state. So that's his analysis of it. That's kind of my analysis of it as well. Is if you have relative decentralization, I'll say this. Chicago was safer when Al Capone ran it as opposed to Lori Lightfoot. Neither of them are moral people, but the power checking that happened during Capone's time, just like the power checking that happened in Somalia after the Civil War, the post-Muhammad Said Barre regime, and the humanitarian gains, which are not insignificant, that happen afterwards because of Zir and Sharia law and people and warlords checking each other, is relevant to look at in even a Western context. You can tell me if I've gone off the rails or if that makes any sense, Keith or Jeremy.
Well, on one hand, you can make the argument that just ordinary organized crime is less objectionable than a state, particularly when you have ideologues that are in charge of a state that are trying to push, the general population towards, some fanatical ideology or something like that. Like, would I rather have a country run by the five families of New York, or would I rather have the Third Reich? Well, for me, it's not even a debate. Of course, the five families are better than the Third Reich. Would I rather have the Bloods, the Crips, the Mexican Mafia running my town, or would I rather have, the ISIS running my town? Well, I'd rather have the gangsters, because, the gangsters are usually just motivated by profit and status, and as long as you stay out of their way and don't make things difficult for them, they're not going to cause a whole lot of problems for you beyond just some basic extortion and that kind of stuff. But when you have fanatical ideologues, those tend to be a lot more problematic because they have this view that everything has to be based on total conformity. It's like, like Mexico. I'd much rather live in Mexico, which is a narco state, than in North Korea. So although even obviously both have problems, so I do think that's a really valid point. And in fact, I think it's basically irrefutable when you compare how different state systems work. Now, I guess a common argument that's used is, what about social conditions? Like whenever I've debated Marxists, they'll say, well, look, would you rather live in Cuba or Haiti? It's like, at least in Cuba, they don't have mass starvation on the level they have in Haiti. So that's a valid point. But as a general rule, I do think that just a mafia state is better than some sort of ideological state.
Okay.
So my general reply would be this. So first off, Somalia. The U.S. has been in Somalia since 2007, and it is the second longest intervention in the region since Afghanistan, rapidly ramping up to be the single longest intervention. The U.S. has AFRICOM in the region to police not only Somalia, but a bunch of other nations there. The U.S. has Middle Eastern control and literally Israel as a vassal state so that they can control those regions. And you know what Somalia being as like warlord run and not like, philosophically centered as it did for that? Nothing. The U.S. is still there. The U.S. has been there. AFRICOM is still there. The U.S.'s vassal states are still there. The Middle East is still their hub. The Middle East is still being run by the West and still a hub for a bunch of murders, for a bunch of, like Libya's an open air slave market now. Yemen is a minefield and like littered with new explosions every day from Saudi munitions and U.S. backed bullshit. Fucking Iran is getting actively threatened by Western powers right now because of the like mass intervention over there and the fact that Iran is like aligned with the BRICS and like other forms of like local counter hegemony to the West. And the fact is that Somalia cannot be a power player in this regard because Somalia is not united enough and not philosophically grounded enough for anarchist unity to be an actual threat to the states, and because they have no like cohesion in terms of their own states, so they will consistently be looted. And it is the same fucking argument that I could make for the US decentralizing in a like quick and non like philosophically grounded way, and a variety of other shit, right? I could make the same argument that the U.S. being fractured for the purpose of two things, like either like the U.S. getting fractured for the purpose of like secession down to a state level so that like people could have like their libertarian paradises on a state level, or getting fractured for the purposes of like isolation of state power along certain like ideological blocks, like it would very like 99% certain turn out to be, would only like reduce the US's power in two ways: by making it like weaker to external attack in the same way Somalia is, from a libertarian perspective because it didn't start out on libertarian grounds, or because it's not a strong enough collection of states. The like organization of people which was already like pushing like buttons fucking everywhere and pissing everyone off, would suddenly have these people be the chickens that come home to roost. And those chickens that come home to roost would be violent shitheads in the same way. We would have the Russian and Chinese equivalent of like fucking AFRICOM in our region tomorrow if they thought they could get away with it because people weren't behaving as blocks either for a complete state like the US is right now, which is the reason they aren't doing it already, or if we had a libertarian cohesive society which was already on board with resisting all power, including foreign power, and had the actual like agencies and organizations and militias built up to withstand these sorts of attacks without any coercion required. If we don't get either one of those things, we're fucked on an international level in the same way that Somalia is fucked on an international level. And like that's the reason why, if we're anarchists and we're not going to pick the option where the state is cohesive and has the most power so that it can resist foreign influence on a state power level, we have to start from anarchist philosophy. And if we don't, we're fucked. Not just by BRICS, but by our own internal failures, because we will lose either internally or externally if we don't have cohesion around some sort of idea, whether that idea be liberty or an anarchy or the state. We need cohesion. We need people to be on the same page where they will not have each other's backs. Society will either crumble from within or be damaged from without. That's the fact.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure I don't sound insane to Keith.
Okay. No, I don't think you sound insane, and I agree with half of that. You should start from the philosophy, but it did nothing. I would disagree. And would everybody be at everybody's backs? Well, I actually have Leeson's statistics pulled up. If you want to actually say it did nothing, look, key development indicators before and after statelessness. Life expectancy went up 2 years. Here's the crazy thing. Maternal mortality rate went down 500. That's huge. And, like a lot of these things went down. Access to sanitation went up. Access to healthy facilities went up. TVs went up. Look at radios. 4.
Okay, so my response to this, because I know what you're doing, is that context is important. Context is key. If we don't have the context surrounding this, we're not going to have the rational opinion. So the context is that Somalia's government was way worse before that than the U.S. is to its own people. Way worse. And that means that it being better than that isn't fucking hard to do. And it means that it's sort of like when Argentina said that under Milei, rent prices dropped 20%. Yeah, they dropped 20% past the previous month when they doubled, because he said that rent could be charged in dollars, and also he's having the value of the peso. So, of course, rent prices spiked, and now that they dropped 20%, libertarians are jacking off about it. But it's not real. It's never real. If we're going to say that, if we're going to use those as our indicators, I don't think that like losing like immediate federal funding and all of these like assets and resources that people rely on would result in like, you know, the dramatic improvement to health and general well-being that it did in Somalia. If you say that it would be 2% better when people suddenly had no access to the federal funds for their programs that they were relying on, America is the biggest welfare state in history. If we suddenly cut off the federal like funding to those programs, no, in fact, the following year would not see an increase in healthcare quality or life expectancy or maternity outcomes or anything else.
Wait.
If we don't start with with like the premise that in fact like our life expectancy is really fucking skyrocketed because of artificial like spending and shit like that, and that people either have to be weaned off of that in a voluntary way, or they will just crash into the abyss, then we're going to miss the vital context that proves that it's not going to be as good as it otherwise could be.
Okay, so a couple of responses to that is this. If you get rid of something that's highly centralized but is not working, eventually the welfare state cannot continue. It's kind of like saying, well, this guy's done so many drugs, so I need to eventually, pull the plug on the drugs or something bad will happen. You're like, no, just let him go. Keep going. The welfare state can't continue because you can't print money infinitely, and everybody knows that. Even I think the Keynesians know that. They're just trying to hopefully like get what they can and then do whatever. A lot of them are old anyway, and Keynes didn't have, from my understanding, future generations, so he didn't care. That being said, here's my response: is that things like the welfare system cannot go forever. Now, maybe Keith can tell me if using Somali is bad argument for anarchy or decentralization, but I think there's relative significance to see that with what they had at the time, they made something to, if you want to call cryptarchy, I think a cousin philosophy to anarchy, maybe that'd be correct, but or close to minarchy, that'd be correct. I don't know if it's exactly minarchy, but what I'd say is this: if you can have tribal people who are not, who have low civic capital, who want to fight each other all the time, cooperate even under hard circumstances, we can. Now, to say that Somalia, that's not a relevant institutional option, when a lot of these neocons or even neolibs or even ANCAP say everybody should be anarcho-capitalist, or everybody should have a constitution, or everybody should have this form of government, I'd have to say, look, you have to realize in the Democratic Republic of Congo, you're not going to get ANCAP stand. They're not going to read Rothbard. They're not going to philosophically start there. But if you got rid of their government, and you got rid of most of the governments in the developing world, the global south would be better off under anarchy. And I'm almost sure of that based on Leeson's data. Now, here in the West, yeah, we can start from philosophical premises based on Bakunin, Rothbard, Konkin, even Triple H is not bad on some things. I don't agree with his arguments on I don't agree with what he wants to do with the anti, but that's my consensus is this: let's start philosophically here, but some cultures that's not going to work. Just allow them to break up. And even in the United States, I still think while you're pushing the ideas, push for decentralization too. It's like building a business and we're arguing, well, I want to get all the tools and everything. I would also argue get the tools, get everything set up. While you're setting up, do other actions as well.
You're saying that the neighbor's building is something that you can take over to start your business in, and they're not going to do shit about it. They will, because they own the building. The people who made this place, the states that run it, those people are the ones we have to go against. If we don't, if we're not able to build our new thing and prove it works, nobody's going to do anything but defend the businesses that already fucking worked. That's the reason, like, hey, people are defending Walmart online right now. Walmart, who is a massive, like, oppressive force to not only business, but the environment, like, global well-being, etc. Walmart is getting defended by people. Instead of building their own business, they are crushing other people's businesses. And that's what we have to fight for. We have to fight to build our own structures instead of trying to, like, invade theirs and then say, no, this is ours now. And also we're going to, like, somehow have the power to resist their existing entrenched power. They already created the states. They already created the territories. They already have all their cameras everywhere. They already have, like, their police forces. They already have their structures set up. And if we want to fight them, we have to convince the common person who relies on these structures, who relies on these existing premises, who already supports this current system because they were trained from cradle to grave to do so. We have to get those people on board by proving that we can not only do better, but do it ethically. And we have to do that, or these people are going to defend the systems that they already defend because they don't want change. They want comfort. They want to go back and watch Netflix. They don't give a fuck about your society, and they're going to defend whatever status quo lets them skate, lets them coast. Unless we can break them free of that mentality, that's what they're going to defend. They're going to snitch on your groups. They're going to help identify people on facial recognition. Hell, the government will probably make an app that lets you, like, scan people's faces and get points for it delivered to your CBDC wallet immediately. This isn't real. If we want to fight these people, we have to prove that we're worth fighting for instead of against. And if we're going to do that, we can't just do that by saying, yes, in fact, the state of Texas should secede from the union because it wants to put razor wire in the water. That's only going to enable the people who don't like us already.
I'm arguing. You finish the thing. Okay. I'm saying this. I'm saying I don't like the razor wire. This is not a good way to deal with it. But here's what I would do. I would advocate for Texas to leave. Then I would say, look at failures of anarchism. Why I'm an anarcho-pluralist. We can do something better than federalism. Read them the actual chapter from Key's book. If anarchy and did all this would not work. So let's get to the local level. Here's Rothbard. Here's Konkin. Here's Kropotkin. Let's figure out how we can make these societies work. Let's figure out how we can make in these societies a version of customary law and reputation work. And then let's see how these societies interact from a sociologist perspective. And I think that would work. It would just take time. I think people do need to read Failures of Anarchism, but they also need to secede. That's kind of my ultimate point. And if they're really crazy like me and then also start going through Demanding the Impossible, which I have those 2 books. I'm actually going to grab them. But Keith.
A number of points there. Talking about Somalia, there's the question of, well, is the Kritarchic system preferable to the whatever they had before? It may be or may not be. It may be entirely subjective to individual experience or opinion. One issue there is I've heard that same argument from tankies before. Like some tankies will say, when it comes to how you evaluate the Soviet Union, the question is, well, not was it paradise, or not even was it as good as, say, the United States during the same period, but was it better than the Tsarist era? That's one argument I hear from that. And there, so it's possible for libertarians or anarchists or whatever to replicate that and say, well, perhaps Somalia is better than what came before, or perhaps Catalonian Spain during the Civil War was better than.
It's relativist fallacy.
Yeah, well, it's you run into this trap of arguing solely on the basis of context, where it wasn't hell on earth, so it was good, it's that's kind of that's so you do want to avoid falling into that. And then whenever people have these ideal societies they point to, or what they think is an ideal model, they tend to often overlook some of the problems with it. Like in Spain, the Spanish anarchists, during the Civil War, a lot of left anarchists will overlook some of the atrocities that were committed by the Spanish anarchist militias. You have the fans of the PKK, the anarchists who are fans of the Kurdish independence movement and Öcalan and that kind of stuff. And a lot of those will deny that there's actually been ethnic violence by Kurds against other ethnic groups like the Assyrians and stuff like that. So you have this same fallacy everywhere. I think, though, that if anarchists, I tend to approach this from what I call an operational perspective, meaning it's not merely constructivist. It's not that, well, we have this abstract ideology and we're going to impose it and see how, and it's got to turn out this way. I tend to look at it more from the point of view of an empirical perspective, where, okay, we have the ideas, we can make the intellectual arguments for the ideas, we can cite historical examples, evidence, all the usual processes. But then there's a question of, well, what would actually happen? Like, how would we grow the number of anarchists? How would that happen? It could happen any number of ways, perhaps. And then the more anarchists you have, what is the implication of that for all these hyphenated anarchist tendencies? I tend to think there would even be more hyphens, not fewer, although some would probably be larger and more influential than others.
And shorter or longer lived.
Yeah. And then there's a question of, well, if anarchists get to the point where anarchists are the largest collection of political philosophies, or say anarchists and their cousin ideologies are the largest collection of political philosophies, just like, say, in the United States, Christian churches are the largest collection of religions. Well, what would be the implication of that for the wider society or institutions? In what way could anarchists or others like them become corrupted? Like, could there someday be a dictatorship saying we are the dictatorship of the anarchist party? It's like, you will absorb anarchy or you will die. It's yeah, and then there's this. Then even in the most ideal world, like let's say um, anarchists are the world's largest collection of political philosophies. All right, just like monotheist religions are the largest collection of religions. All right, then there's the question of, well, is there a conflict between decentralist anarchy and ideological anarchism? And we were talking about how, yes, there can be a conflict, between the two. And then there gets into the question, well, you have anarchist movements worldwide, but then you also have people who want to decentralize, but they want to decentralize for non-anarchistic purposes. Right? So how do you respond to that? Right. Then there's also the question of culture, like what would be the prevailing set of cultural norms or practices in a world where anarchist philosophies were prevalent? Does that mean everybody's going to be super woke, like some of the social justice anarchists? Does that mean everybody's going to be a cultural conservative, like Hans Hermann Hoppe? Does that mean everybody's going to be a Christian anarchist, like Leo Tolstoy? Well, it probably doesn't mean everybody's going to be anything, but you can also ask the question of what would be the largest cultural paradigm. You could, for example, I could envision, a future Russia where, half the population are Tolstoyan anarchists and the other half are Bakuninist. And not that it's necessarily going to happen or turn out that way, but it's theoretically possible. And what would be the social and cultural implications for that?
You mean like having long-term thought, projecting your thoughts into the future, thinking like maybe there might be consequences to certain things and we shouldn't idealize the future any more than we idealize the present? Fuck, that makes utopia harder.
I guess I go back to I really like his podcast. I can't think of the name, but you're on it. The other guy who has glasses and a beard, I can't remember his name, on his podcast as well too.
That I'm on?
Yeah. He posed an interesting question. Maybe I'd like to throw an answer to it. Let's say you do have an ANCAP factory, and then you have syndicalists there who we said, okay, you could unionize. Then they start trying to say like, okay, we're actually going to fight the ANCAPs, and then it's like, okay, they're fighting. Then the sterner people are like, let them duke it out. And the Buddhist anarchists are like, we don't care. The primitivists say, why would you fight over industrial powers anyway? What would you say? Like, hey, do you call like your ANCAP representative or your syndicalist board and say like, hey, what do you do? What actually do you do in that situation? Not that I don't know if I'll ever get there, but those are things that I do think about. Both from a perspective.
I suppose a Sternerite anarchist would say, just let them fight and let the best team win. Whoever wins the fight keeps the means of production.
Yeah, fair enough.
What? ANCAP and anarcho-syndicalist fight club.
But at the same time, so that's one of the things, because like even in your piece on the site, you said like call your ANCAP rep for the syndicalist society if your workers are deciding to unionize. If your workers decide to unionize, let them, or you're not anarchist. If your workers want to unionize and you resort to calling an ANCAP, and that ANCAP can impose anything on your institution and stop your work and stop these people from doing voluntarily what they want, then that wouldn't be unity at all. That would just be the supremacy of ANCAP, and like, we'll let you play in the toy box for a bit until you do something we don't like, and then we'll take your toys away. We have to, like, if we want true unity, then we've got to start from a precept that people engaging in anarchist action would be allowed to engage in that anarchist action. And so if like there was sort of a fight between ANCAPs and syndicalists, I would hope that the syndicalists would win, because unionizing for better treatment and, the gradual dispersal of power toward like the bottom away from the top is a good thing for anarchy. It's not a bad thing. And if anybody disagrees with that, then they're not a decentralist, because that's a fundamentally decentralist proposition, is that the power being closer to the bottom and further from the top is a good thing. So if somebody thinks that syndicalism is not like a viable thing, or doesn't like the idea of unions, I would argue that they're huge centralists and that they betray the principles of anarcho-capitalism in doing so. Really, the syndicalists and the ANCAPs should get along fucking famously, as long as the ANCAPs aren't treating their workers like shit. And if they are, they're basically no better than a state anyway.
Well, that gets back to one of the big debates you have between different types of anarchists, and that's the issue of hierarchy. You know, like to what degree is a hierarchy compatible with an anarchy? You know, there are some that say, well, what matters is voluntarism. Like whatever, as long as it's voluntary, it's not really that much of a problem. But then there's others who say, well, no, you can have, you know, theoretically voluntary hierarchies that can also be oppressive or abusive. You know, for example, you can have people that belong to some kind of cult, you know, where everybody worships the leader. And even if they're not physically forced at gunpoint to belong to the cult, you know, there's this process of manipulation or exploitation involved that makes it into a tyranny of its own. Yeah, I think there's room for differences of opinion on that, but it is one of the big debates among anarchists, and that applies to economic relations too. Like the anarcho-communist or syndicalist view of labor relations is that work is not voluntary. That if you have a job, even if you're not physically forced, by or to work at, if you're not forced at gunpoint to work at McDonald's, or if there's no law requiring you to work at McDonald's, it may be that you're still forced to work at McDonald's on the basis of material need. And can material need be just as oppressive or authoritarian or whatever, or create circumstances that are just as oppressive or authoritarian as anything a state is capable of imposing? Like I've discussed this, for example, with socialists before. They'll say, look, Amazon has as much authority over its employees as any state anywhere, perhaps even more, because, most of the time the state is not necessarily right there in your face in the same way that your employer is. So what would you say to that?
I'll give you, well, here's the thing. I can choose to work for Amazon or not. What I'd probably say is this, because there are, I'm trying to be more objective. There are syndicalists who do tell me in Discord, we'll get we'll work with the ANCAPs, we'll get rid of them. But there are anarchists who are not statists particularly, but they're like, okay, the state's gone, like let's get them. And of course there are ANCAPs who say the dirty commie Pinochet garbage. I don't like that either. I would say if the syndicalists start the conflict, then we need to stop it. And I'd say if the ANCAPs started, that whoever is starting the fight is wrong. What I'd say that this is, Amazon's almost a fascist corporation where Bezos is working with the government hand in hand. The only fundamental difference is you can leave. You can opt out of Amazon. You don't have to use Prime. You can say, I'm gone, done, bye, see you later, Bezos. I'm going to go somewhere where I can use the bathroom, or you can start, try and figure out something online or do something else. I think that's the fundamental difference. People have said, like, Kareem, what's the difference between religion and the state? Like, how can you still, be pro-Islamic, listen to Shiad Bolson, Middle Nation, still want to do Islam and then be an anarchist? And people can't if I say I'm a libertarian Muslim, that's weirder to them than maybe some of these crazy categories that they've heard. Like, a Muslim libertarian? Is that even possible? I'm like, yes, there's Sufi versions of anarchism. So my answer is you can still be part of something that still has a hierarchy, like an imam or a rabbi or a sheikh or a boss or a mentor or mentee type situation. And I don't think the left, even in particular, is against hierarchy, except Kropotkin, or Maltese, even though I think Maltese is the best. But Bakunin said, I will defer, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Germany, I defer to the authority of the shoemaker because I can't make shoe, or I defer to the authority of the electrician. I think most people would. Anarchists aside, if your lights go out, you're like, and the electrician pulls up. I know people say fix it on YouTube, but let's say your lights go out and your phone's dead. You're like, all right, electrician, or plumber, I'll do whatever you say. I'll submit to the authority of expertise. I've argued that Peterson's hierarchy of competence, as he says, fine. The only hierarchy should be hierarchies of competence. If you're better at said skill, then yes, there'll be hierarchies, because there's hierarchies in a lot of things, like martial arts in an anarchist society. Okay, I still have to do the jujitsu things to get blue belt, black belt, all this stuff. So that'd be my response to them on hierarchies, and that'd be my response to them on Amazon. This is in no way an endorsement of Jeff Bezos or him working with the CIA or the MI military industrial complex or any of the egregious things that him or other state capitalists like Bill Gates or Musk or any of these people do. But I would say there is a fundamental distinction that you can say, I'm done with Amazon, I'm dissociating. And in the case of hierarchy, I think the only hierarchies should be people who have more experience. And that goes to elders too. I actually thought about this. People said, Kareem, would there be anybody to like guide and advise? Like if you have an ANCAP who's been around for a while, then or who has good knowledge, then yeah, I'd say like have this person be like, just like you go to the imam and you say, well, can I do this? Can I drink alcohol once in a while? He's like, no. It's like, hey, pick your favorite, hey, Jack Lloyd, or hey, Jeremy, as an agorist, can I make an international? I have a garden. I did well. Can I make an international conglomerate of gardens? It's like, no, dude, that's a bad idea. Or hey, can I take this communal property hey, elder, can I take this communal property for myself in Twin Oaks? No, this is communal property. Same thing with primitivists. I have respect for the Hadza and the San Bushmen and stuff, and they do have elders. So there is hierarchy in anarchist societies if you consider the San Bushmen and the Hadza to be anarchist institutions. And credit to the like red pill male movement that's like eat a bunch of meat and stuff. I don't agree with all of that, but what's funny is like people like Dr. Saladino have seen the structure of even primitivist societies that are completely primitivist. They don't really have anything that we'd call a government, yet they do have some kind of elder in the hierarchy who in the case of San Bushmen or stuff like that. And they do have arbitration as well. Like even in things like the Taliban is decentralized, even though I don't agree with their religious practices or anything they do. People say, oh, I had a fight, and you bring in that elder, and literally it's funny. You'll see a dude like in a living room, like, no, this was bad. You can't do this to your wife, blah, blah, blah. That's my answer to hierarchy and Amazon. I don't know if that was sufficient.
Well, as far as the Bakunin quote about deferring to experts, I did hear some anarchists citing that quote in defense of Dr. Fauci during the pandemic. So it's interesting how anything can be twisted in its own way. Yeah, because after all, he's the expert, so we should listen to him.
Yeah, and like that's the thing. It wasn't about real authority. What he was saying is that because the bootmaker has the expertise on what they're talking about, that their authority supersedes any state telling them how to make boots. He wasn't saying that you should beg and obsequiously grovel to the bootmaker to give you the proper boot. You should not be a literal bootlicker in order to follow Bakunin. What you should do is you should recognize that the bootmaker does not need central management in order to make boots, and that oftentimes bootmakers will make them without government oversight. In fact, most of the time. And that's the real shit. And so, like, the common person could be one of those bootmakers if they learn to make boots. And their authority should be deferred to rather than some centrally managed authority of the state to make their own product. He wasn't saying that, like, this authority is on the same level or the same variety of the authority that the state claims. He's saying that certain authority is legitimate and certain authority is not, and that the authority that is legitimate can prove itself and does not need the force of the state in order to make it happen.
Okay, and what I'd say in response, Keith, to Dr. Fauci is a couple things. Even if somebody says I have authority because I'm an expert in an ANCAP or ANCOM society, you could look up, like, I'm big on data. And I said, okay, I didn't even say Dr. Fauci was horrible at first. I said, okay, let me see what this guy does.
I
He's
did.
And I said, look, I looked at actual data. Not everyone's going to do this, but if one person does it, it's beneficial to say, hey, guys, I looked up this guy. He's an administrative doctor. He hasn't seen any patients. I don't really think he has the authority you think he has. Just like me saying, like, I'm a heavyweight champion and I've only been to, like, local gyms, or I'm an international fighting and stuff like that. So that's one thing. Then I looked at the CDC's distinction and stuff like that. So my thing would be, if somebody wants to claim they are an authority, but they don't, in an anarchist society, but they don't have the empirical backing in some legitimate form based on reputation and signaling mechanisms, which is inherently ANCAP, but it's not. The distinction is the Austrian idea of recognizing it, but people still take reputation. If you put reputation along with authority, I think, and signaling, which is just saying, okay, well, he has this. Like if I have a plaque on a crypto channel, I'm not showing this off, but maybe if I have a plaque on a crypto channel, it means I might know something about how, like, MetaMask works. Like, people ask me, like, and I say, here's my advice, but this is not definitive. Do your own research. And I say that, I have 135 subs, so I'm very, very careful. Do your own research. Always do your own research. I'm not telling you this is good or bad. I'm saying do your own. So that's what I think an authority figure would do is, okay, you could have someone like Fauci and say, like, I think you should wear a mask everywhere in an anarchist society. But then you do your own research. Like, no, I don't think this elder or this ANCAP advisor on my council is good, or my syndicalist board is making much sense. So I guess the fundamental distinction from an authority in a statist sense is you have to listen to them. An authority in ANCAP, ANCOM, and Prim Society is you can take their advice as maybe more experienced, but you don't have to. It doesn't. You're not begrudged. Like maybe the Hadza elder says stop eating honey directly from the bees, and you're like, no, bro, I got stung. We all cool. Like, because funny enough, if you see the Hadza, they do eat honeycombs just like that. So they probably have higher testosterone than all of us.
But see, here's the thing. The reason I'm bringing that up is because the whole idea of, like, sicking capitalists on syndicalists, that already happens. We can do that without the state, without the state being abolished. And so if we're going to have anarchist unity, we need to recognize that the ultimate goal should be giving the common person as much power as possible over their own lives. If not, we're already basically replicating the state and its power and its, like, designs, utility, etc. And we should start from the percentage, like the highest percentage likelihood of not replicating the state, and that is telling these people that this society that has been built on coercion, enslavement, rape, pedophilia, fucking war, massacres,
Yes.
poisoning everybody, all this shit, that is based on the evils that provide the root of the state capitalist mentality, or the tanky mentality, or the whatever oppressor mentality. And we need to get back from that. And the whole point of anarcho-syndicalism is to give the workers control over their own input in a company. And so if they don't have that control, if they're not allowed to, because your workers are unionizing, so call your ANCAP rep, that just sounds like a threat against a different type of anarchist.
No. Okay, so I really want to clear what I'm saying. It's actually praise the fault. First of all, I looked up the channel just to clear my name on this. it's Praise the Folly. Keith was on there. I really like this guy, so I was watching it, and he did pose a question. Okay, if syndicalist militia fought in an ANCAP thing, what would happen? And then he gave like what the primitivists would say, why you fight in a factory. The Buddhists would say this. So I'm not saying sick anybody. I don't want anybody to fight anybody. I don't think that's a good idea unless they want to voluntarily do it in a boxing match or MMA. All I'm saying is this. I'm curious to see, because I have heard both on the left and the right, like ANCAPs do say the stupid Pinochet thing once in a while. And
Every day.
Okay, fine. But I am in literal syndicalist servers who say once we get rid of the state, we don't want to be a small microcosm in ANCAPstan. We want to take some stuff over. So there are people on the left who are prone to violence as well, and we should acknowledge that. My thing was just kind of examining these things so they don't become bad, so you can solve what Leeson would call the HCQ, which is having a stateless society that creates a greater or equal amount of wealth to state-run societies. Because if we can do that, we can get the ANCAPs and the syndicalists to shake hands, then you actually have a very good case for narco-pluralism, and maybe, just maybe, we have something that is probably the best political system that humans can create, more than federalism, more than BRICS, more than these NATO things, more than global institutions.
But we have to start from the premise that everybody should be allowed to do what they're doing. If we don't start from that premise and allow them the freedom to do what they're doing, then they won't get there and stay there. And so, like, my ultimate thing, and the reason I'm bringing this up, is because that's how you get that foundation. That's how you get that, like, it's not, Reed Bakunin. It's not, have you heard of our Lord and Savior, Samuel Edward Konkin III? What it is very specifically and very directly, build your shit. And if people come to your shit and it works effectively enough, then your shit will seem effective. And people will flock to it and not attack it. If you don't build your shit and you're just expecting the state and its entities to back your shit ain't gonna fly. So build your shit, make it work well enough that people want to join your shit, and then get together with those people so that you can form a block against aggressors, whether those aggressors be the state where you are, or BRICS, or some sort of aggressor within your community. You build what you have, and you don't stop building that, and you prove it works. You don't tell people to read theory, you become theory.
All right. Well, on that note, I'll say the best way to become theory is, sorry, my internet's going in and out, virtue of Comcast, which is a monopoly, but not a violent one.
Stream's going great. I hope it's still working. I hope people can still hear us.
The best way to theory is, I think, these two books. I think for well-read theories, my friend Jack Lloyd is really good with ANCAP theory. My friend Lizard Jesus is very good with EgoCom theory or ANCOM theory. And Jeremiah is also really good with stuff, and I'd say in particular agorism. I was actually going to ask one last thing, Keith, get your thoughts on a particular individual, because I know he was an anarchist, and he has some very good, or as they say, base takes, but he was violent. I have some friends who are Black Flag anarchists, and kind of interested in your opinion on like Nestor Makhno. Would you say is like, okay, this is a good thing to look at, a good guy to look at, or is he maybe too for anarchism?
Hey, Kareem, is he maybe too what?
Is he maybe too violent in some of his methods to be looked at as a good figure for anarchism?
Well, one thing that's interesting about him is that his militia was one of the few anarchist armies in history that could actually win fights. Like, one of the characteristics of the Spanish anarchist militias is that they perform very poorly from a military perspective. I mean, relatively. Now they were up against impossible odds, so you've got to consider the context. But one of the primary arguments anybody ever uses against anarchists is that anarchists would just simply be conquered by some external force because they wouldn't have an army of self-defense. That's probably one of the main arguments against the anarchist position. And the Machno movement was actually an anarchist tendency that actually included a genuine fighting force. Now, like any kind of army, though, they had their limitations. Like, I've heard stories about them doing things like, attacking Mennonite communities in Ukraine and stealing land or property from them. I've heard of Machno personally shooting people for expressing opinions he disagreed with, like, for example, anti-Semitism or something like that, which was commonplace in that region at that time, or it still is. And so, the guy definitely had an authoritarian streak that I think is somewhat inconsistent with anarchism. But then there's also things you can learn from him as well. And I'd say that about all of these historic anarchist figures or movements or tendencies. It's like, it's not a good plan to idealize any of them. Like, in my most anarcho-syndicalist days, like back when I belonged to the IWW and groups like that, I knew people who worship Spanish anarchism. They would say constantly, well, in Spain, they did it like this. Well, in Spain, they did it like this. Yeah, but my thing was, what if they got it wrong, though? I mean, and you have that among other philosophies as well. I mean, that's not unique to, like, the Social Democrats. They constantly talk about, well, in Sweden, they have this. In Sweden, they have that. Or the tankies, in China or whatever. But yeah, I mean, Machno is interesting. There's things you can learn from him. There's things about him you wouldn't want to repeat.
I agree. Sorry, my internet is acting up. So just bear with me. But yeah, no, that's interesting. And yeah, I'm not perfect. I do like General Lee. So, and that was by no means a perfect society. That had significant problems. So did Jefferson Davis. He was not an ideal person.
Well, I mean, like, that gets back to what I was saying. Anything from history that you look at, you can learn something from it. But then there's always something you don't want to repeat. Like I mentioned earlier, ancient Greece, they lacked.
But yeah, I switch. I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting.
Yeah, like ancient Greece, they lacked an overarching state system. Even if internally in some of the Greek cities they had things like slavery and lots of other negatives. The Holy Roman Empire of the Middle Ages, I think, is interesting because it was a polycentric system where no one institution was able to get complete authority. But then you also had feudal lords that mistreated peasants. You had wars between rival royal dynasties. The church had power to repress heretics and things like that. So you wouldn't want to copy that aspect of it. Another example is in the Ottoman system, the Ottoman Turks, in their system, you had the millet system where people of different ethno-religious cultures were able to practice some degree of self-determination, even though it was within this wider imperium. But at the same time, I mean, nobody really wants to bring back the Ottoman Empire. Like in the Ottoman Empire, if you have the rank of a sultan, you could execute somebody just on a whim. You could just say, I want that person dead, and kill them. So you don't want to copy that part of it. We mentioned China in one of the other episodes about how China was sort of a proto-monarchy. And in many ways it was. At the same time, one of their preferred methods of execution was through slicing, where meaning that they would tie a person up and they'd use something kind of like a paring knife and just slowly peel their skin off of them. So we don't really want to do that. No. And any society from history, like a lot of American style libertarians deify the American founding fathers. On the left, it's more fashionable to bash all those guys. I mean, they were a mixed bag, we can go through their record. Like Thomas Jefferson in many ways was very ahead of his time. But then if you look at his other views, he wanted to castrate homosexuals He sounded like something out of the Taliban or something, ISIS or something when it came to that issue.
Yeah.
And in any culture is the same way. You can look at or even early anarchists. If you look at if you go back and look at some of the ideas that some of the early anarchists had on the Jews or on women or on any of those kinds of topics, you can see that by today's standards they sound almost like fascists or something, and that's everywhere. So the thing is to take what's helpful and discard things that are not.
Evolve by adopting the good traits and genetically selecting out the bad ones. In this case, ideologically instead of physically, because we're not Malthusian eugenicists. That's the job of the state.
Correct. All right. Well, let me ask you this. I guess the big, if there's a fight at a bar, there's usually someone who's pretty proficient at breaking it up, or maybe gets punched in the face once in a while. Would you consider somebody who has a good understanding of Joseph Pierre Proudhon, which there are people to do it, like, hey, if there is, I guess my answer to this is, if there's fighting between syndicalists and ANCAPs, or ANCOMs and ANCAPs, or if there's fighting between technical anarchists, if you want to call them, or green anarchists,
side with whoever's method increases freedom the most. That seems like the good way to think. If one side of a given conflict is going to result in less freedom, don't side with them. We're anarchists. We're shooting for 0% authoritarianism. So, or just stay out of it. Some things are just none of somebody's business. But like, if it's a choice, if you're making a choice, choose freedom.
Okay. Freedom, but to me, freedom comes from, I do agree with Mises in a way, freedom comes from social cooperation. So how do you get them to socially cooperate? Everyone understands Proudhon, they understand mutualism, so they can probably what I would do if I see ANCAPs and syndicalists fighting is be like, hey, can we get a Proudhonian to come up with some basic consensus or proxy so we can behind us? And the same thing I'd call someone who understands solar punk to be like, hey, can you make the premies and the technical dudes not like want to tear each other apart and show them how you can come to a nice crossroads between technology and complete primitivism. I know solar punks and mutualists aren't perfect either, but to me that actually is my solution. And then also having people understand pan-anarchism, working with the mutualists because they understand all sides, so they can help mitigate conflict.
But like I said, you get people to understand these things not by throwing books at them or telling them to, read Mises.org or, go to LibCom or Anarchist Library or whatever. You don't do it by telling them to read theory. You read the theory and then you prove it works. So you become the theory. You live the theory. You are the theory. And then as that example, proving that these theories can result in free societies and then keeping your society free, people will want to cooperate with you. In fact, to put it in a way that you would probably appreciate, you need your reputation to, stand the test of time. You need to be able to demonstrate that based on your actions, you live your principles. Then people who share your principles enough to want to work with you will do so. If you don't, then you're not earning it, and you're just acting by fiat and are no better than the state.
Well, I'm not printing any money, so.
No, it's not. Fiat just means let it be. You don't need fiat currency to be fiat. Fiat is just like it's by decree.
Oh, that was a bad joke. And then I guess since it's going on 2.5 hours, I know it went a little bit long, but Keith, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that. If there is either direct kinetic conflict or high property disagreements between left and right, someone like Sean Wilber or somebody who understands Joseph Pierre Proudhon, a good mediator between maybe Austrian and Kropotkin or like Bakunin thought.
Yeah, well, I don't know that there's any one right answer to that. it would all depend on what people decide for themselves in particular context. Like, I could definitely see a situation where you've got rival anarchist factions who say, well, rather than fight a civil war over all this stuff, why don't we come up with some kind of system of mediation or negotiation or arbitration or, something like that. Or, maybe we, select an arbiter who's going to make the final decision if nobody can agree, and we agree to go by what the arbiter says. And I think that's really, as far as it needs to go. I mean, I don't know that there has to be any one specified plan for how to deal with these issues.
There shouldn't be.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I think. Well, that's like people have asked me before, like, how would I go about defining property rights? Because different types of libertarians or anarchists have different ideas on what property rights are. And my view on that is that property rights are social conventions. They're like different ideas that different societies have on religious beliefs and food customs and sexual morals and favorite music and dress and all kinds of stuff. And different kinds of societies would have different kinds of property rights that would be based on localized agreements by localized groups. For example, if you go to the North Sentinel Islands, which is a group of islands in the Indian Ocean, where you still find uncontacted people that are, I guess, this place is like an anarcho-primitivist dream homeland, except the people there, the indigenous people there, if you actually show up from the outside, they'll shoot you with a bow and arrow and they'll kill you. They actually did that. There was this American Christian guy who said he was going to be a missionary to this place. So he went there carrying a Bible and they ran an arrow right through him. So I guess he got to be a martyr for his faith or whatever. But, but their version of property rights might be something that was incomprehensible to somebody living in the United States, and vice versa. Like one issue I've had. Where'd Kareem go? Drop out?
Yeah, his internet fucked up. I hope that the stream is still going. I think that the fact that it's not hosted on his machine means that since he dipped out, the stream is still live. I can actually check that though. Let me. It'd be fucking hilarious if suddenly everything just goes down because he's down, but I don't think that's how this software works. But like, yeah, I mean, you're on a roll. Like, I feel like it's not a matter of seeking a single thing. I feel like it's a matter of plurality with conflict resolution too, because I think that it's just another thing people are marketing. Yeah, we're still live. People should market their particular type of conflict resolution, and if they can't, it's probably because their reputation sucks. Probably because they don't seem like they're solving their own conflicts, so why should they solve yours?
Yeah, well, and then one size fits all models typically don't work that well anyway. Like Ayn Rand, for instance, was famous for saying that Native Americans didn't have rights because they didn't have any conception of property. And I'm like, well, they had their own version of property. They had their own versions of what for them property is owned by the tribe collectively or by the clan or something like that, or by a family. They didn't have this kind of Lockean view of what property is.
And somehow they didn't need it.
Yeah, and I've heard today you'll hear some of the Zionists say that, like some of the Randians are also fanatical Zionists, like Yaron Brook and people like that, and they'll say, well, the Palestinians, they don't have rights because they don't believe in property rights or whatever. I'm like, I mean, they tilled the land in Palestine for centuries, and until all of these external fanatics started showing up and trying to dispossess them, so it's. The idea that they don't have a conception of property rights is stupid. I mean,
because they don't believe in the principles in the way that I believe in them. I don't have to follow them. My principles are as shallow as yours. I am awesome.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
Yeah, we gotta have more of this conversation on a day when your internet isn't fucked.
Yeah. You know what? Maybe Zerzan's right. Maybe this whole maybe, you know what? Anarcho-primitivists are the only true anarchists.
See,
that
and you know, I was asked the other day what kind of anarchist I identify with, and I said I'm closer to eco anarchists like and Prims and Greens, and this person acted like that they had never actually met somebody who would come out and say that, and I'm like, yeah, here's all my reasons, and also here's a series of rants against tech, and this person's like, oh, you know, honestly, this is a lot less insane than I thought it was, but
you
either
need to
way,
give. Oh.
Huh?
Well, there's a difference between green and primitivism, though. I think
right. I'm somewhere between those generally, though. I'm just suspicious of industry, technology, that which pollutes, that which destroys, that which wastes.
I'm more
Go,
actually like.
You were gonna say though the differences?
Oh well, the primitivists I think are a little more extreme, a little
Yes.
bit more line than the green anarchists. Like the Greens have something of a critique of industrial civilization, and they prefer the model of pre-industrial agricultural societies. But the primitivists are anti-agriculture. I mean, in fact, that's why they call themselves primitivists. They say no, the invention of agriculture was really the fall from grace, and we need to go back to the pre agricultural era.
Yeah. Which, like, I see. The thing is, I sympathize with that, but I also sympathize with the others, and like I sympathize with all of these schools of anarchy. I find myself in that mode more and more because I find that the tech is enabling a terrible culture, and that since politics are downstream from culture, tech is a catalyst for evil in these hands and for these purposes. And I think that's something we should really do. I think we should have a stream where we have you and also as many green/prim/whatever anarchists on as possible. I think that would be good.
One fellow that would be good for that might be Derek Jensen. I've done some programs with him in the past from Deep Green Resistance.
See if you can get in contact.
Yeah, he's on my Facebook friends page. I've been on some programs with him. I've been on the Praise of Folly program with him before.
We could get Zerzan and Jensen. That might be good. If anybody would have any objections to that.
Yeah, and then there's Lee. I think Leah Keith is a green anarchist, isn't she? She's a friend of Derek's. And then there's also the guy that edits the Winter Oak website. I think Paul Kutnek is his name. I think he's a green anarchist as well. So that's a pretty good.
Either way, though, I think that at this point, Kareem's internet is telling him that this stream is too long. So
Yeah. Well, yeah. I guess maybe it is. So, with that being said, I hope everybody enjoyed. Check out Insanity is Free and Anarch Unity, and
no, don't ever look at anything I do. I'm evil.
yeah, he's bad. You just use AI. The AI is the best thing. You should use it also for your art. No, I'm kidding. And you can check out Keith Preston at attackthesystem.com. You can check me out at the Essential Libertarians channel or Cream6633 on X. Thank you for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.